Hi, listeners. This is the 80,000 Hours podcast, where each week we have an unusually in-depth conversation about one of the world's most pressing problems and how you can use your career to solve it. I'm Rob Wiblin, Director of Research at 80,000 Hours. Today's guest is out to explain why the internet is changing who wields power in society, and how that's creating big shifts in our politics. At the end, this time around, we've added a discussion of the episode and its implications, featuring me, my producer Keiran Harris, and one of 80,000 Hours' career advisors, Michelle Hutchinson. It's a bit of an experiment, and one we might continue if it seems useful and people like it. As always, you should never finish listening to an episode that you've started if you're not actually finding it entertaining or useful. Just turn it off and listen to something better rather than get dissatisfied and unsubscribe. And obviously that also goes for our conversation at the end of the show. In my view, that's also how you should approach all books, movies, TV shows, newspaper articles, and so on. Or at least that's how I do it. The opportunity cost of listening to one thing is not listening to another one. And having started something, as far as I can tell, gives me no particular reason to finish it. So completionism does not make a lot of sense to me. If you do enjoy this conversation, though, you should definitely look out for my interview with economist Glenn Weil about his book, Radical Markets, which touches on many of the same political themes that come up today. That one should go out to subscribers in the next few weeks. All right, here's Martin. Today, I'm speaking with Martin Gurri. Martin is a geopolitical analyst and follower of new media and information dynamics. He spent many years working in a small part of the CIA dedicated to the analysis of openly available media such as television and newspapers. After leaving work in government, Gurri focused his research on the impact that a networked public with access to a wide range of competing information sources has had on politics and culture, writing actively on his blog, The Fifth Wave. He co-authored Our Visual Persuasion Gap in 2010, before in 2014 self-publishing The Revolt of the Public, The Crisis of Authority in the New Millennium. Many people have come to see the insights in that book as key to explaining changes in politics that have become highly visible in the last few years. As we record this interview, rioters in Paris seem to be acting out more or less the dynamic Martin outlines in his book. In reference to Trump and Brexit, economist Arnold Kling commented, Martin Gurri saw it coming. As a result, the book was officially published by Stripe Press this December, with a new series of chapters dedicated to recent events. So thanks so much for coming on the podcast, Martin.
Well, happy to be here. Happy to talk to you. Happy to be hawking my book to your audience.
I think they're going to enjoy it. So yeah, I hope to get to talking about kind of counter arguments to the ideas you're putting forward and perhaps the implications that it might have for listeners who are trying to improve the world. But first, I almost always start these interviews by asking, what are you working on at the moment, and why do you think it's really important?
Well, I'm working on getting the ideas in the book out as widely as possible, obviously. I wrote the book for a very particular reason, which is I thought that there was a misunderstanding, or at least a lack of understanding of the kind of world we live in. People kind of tend to look backwards, the rearview mirror, and I thought things had happened to our technology and our social life that had profoundly changed the way we interact, that had impacted politics as well, and that most people were not aware of and kept using the old terminologies of politics and the old ideologies of politics that seemed to blind them to what was happening. So the idea is trying to write articles, trying to write posts on my blog, trying to do things like I'm doing right here to disseminate the ideas and, like I said, hawk the book.
All right. Well, let's dive into it. I'm going to try to move fairly swiftly through outlining the ideas in the book because listeners can listen to the audiobook or they can buy the book. And I'll link to some MP3s where there's already really good explanations. I guess you've given some talks and some other interviews. But nonetheless, let's start at the beginning. What is the core argument that you're making?
Okay. The book is called The Revolt of the Public. Baldly stated, the revolt of the public is a collision between information wielded by ordinary people and power represented by the elites who run the institutions of modern society. That's the basic one-line description. I can go on a little bit if you want.
Yeah, so I guess what's changed about the public's relationship to kind of information and authority?
Well, I believe you mentioned what was happening in France recently with the yellow vests, and I hope before this is done, we have a chance to talk about Europe. But let's turn to the United States for a minute. Every institution we have inherited from that industrial age is in crisis. The elites, I think, who run these institutions are distrusted and despised. When you think back on John F. Kennedy's day, people would be asked whether they trusted government. And the answers would range between 70 and 80%. Yes, we trust government. When you ask people today, it's below 30% invariably. For Congress, it's in the teens. This isn't an American predicament. I just mentioned Europe. And this isn't just about government either. For example, journalism, the news, when you ask people whether they trust the news, they also get 30% or less. So the days when a journalist, an anchorman, could be voted the most trusted man in America, those days are long gone. So something has changed, right? Many things you can say have changed. One obvious change is between JFK's time and ours, the amount of information available to ordinary people has multiplied, virtually to infinity. From the time of the cave paintings until about the year 2000, information grew in this slow, stately manner. Then things started to go crazy. In the year 2002, the amount of information doubled the previous total from all of history. 2003, it doubled 2002. That pattern has more or less continued. If you chart this trend, it looks like a gigantic wave, a tsunami. Now, if you read the book, you know that I have that chart in the book. If you look at it hard enough, you can find almost anything that is happening now and that has followed. Revolts, repudiation, the yellow vests, the disintegration of institutions and almost of countries. Even if you look hard enough, you could probably find Donald Trump in there somewhere, okay? You can't look on that chart without thinking, how can human relations and institutions that are based on that old industrial model survive a battering from this monster? This came to me gradually as I worked at CIA. I don't know if you want to talk about that for a bit, because it was an interesting process as it happened.
It's kind of the core argument is that the public now has access to so many more points of view, so much more evidence, so much more information that they're able to challenge authorities that previously they kind of just had to take their word for what they were saying. Yeah, how did you develop this theory? Did you kind of have these ideas back when you were working at the CIA and then develop them after you left?
I worked at CIA, as you probably have already mentioned, and I had what was probably the least glamorous, but it turned out to be the most significant corner to myself of that organization. I never had my 00 license to kill, but I had access to all of global media, if necessary, with translations. And let me tell you, I'm old enough that when I started doing that, even for a developed country, even for a Britain, for example, if you wanted to find what there was in open media that was of interest to the government of the United States, you could every day say, well, here's this very discrete package that this is what's going on in this particular country. At a certain moment, again, things started to go haywire. After, of course, the digital explosion hit, it became that even very underdeveloped countries with very little formal media suddenly were awash with information. And what we noticed was, as this wave was going around the world, politics started to go into turbulence. There was a very distinct correlation between the wave of information, the tsunami, hitting these countries and their politics going crazy. Some of them had been countries that had been, if you think of Egypt, for example, the Hosni Mubarak's regime, he was called a pharaoh. It'd been there for 30 years. It was immovable, and his son was supposed to inherit when he died. And he was gone in 3 weeks. So there were a core of us there that thought this has completely radically changed the way the world works. The old world, the institutions owned the information. We trusted them because we had no alternative but to trust them. They were, for example, they were the media, and they told us this is the event you need to look at. The fact that there were many other events that were not being discussed wasn't obvious to anybody because they chose the same narrow set. Or you're the government and you're saying, well, this is what's important, and you explained why it was important, and you explained how it should be interpreted. So if it was 9/11, for example, even as close as that, you can say, well, they hate us because of our freedom and not necessarily because of our foreign politics, right? So the people from the government, the elites that ran the government, had the authority to provide the information, frame it, and explain the world. That's gone. That's completely gone. And with that gone, there's been a bleeding away of authority, for government and for these institutions. And a public has been created that is essentially very angry, and we can discuss the reasons why, and they're all speculative. We can say with that question that the public is not happy with the status quo. Why that is very debatable, but it is essentially mired in what I call negation. It is against the public. If you want to unify a movement like, for example, the Yellow Vests in Europe, or the anti-Mubarak movement in Egypt, or the Indignados in Spain, or the occupiers here in the U.S. There were people from very different backgrounds. There were people from very different ideologies. So they unified against. So the more against you could be, and the more you could build on that negation, the more powerful these movements became. The problem with that, of course, is at some point you need a positive, program. You need to transition to some kind of alternative to the status quo, and the public does not seem to be interested in that.
So basically, it's a lot easier now for just random members of the public, you or me, or anyone else, to challenge what scientists are saying, what journalists are saying, what politicians are saying. Just throw rocks at them and say you guys are full of shit, basically. And basically, people are taking up this opportunity. They're challenging all of these authorities, and basically, their credibility is being whittled away.
And I would say a lot of the times they're right. That's the unfortunate part. I mean, if you could say, well, if you said this is all fake news and this is all people who don't know what they're talking about, challenging experts who do know what they're talking about. But I think part of the mode of being of the old way, that, by the way, I lived a sizable chunk of my life under, so I understand it very well, was there were people who knew, and there were problems. The word problem is a big word in the industrial market, because then you come up with almost a mathematical solution to it. Every political situation, every political condition that people feel unhappy about is a problem that has a solution. And if you are running, for example, for president, you have the solution. Let me give you my solution. And what's happened now, of course, is whatever anybody says in terms of running for office, or I'll do this or I'll do that, can be easily exposed for. We don't really know. It turns out we know a lot less than the old model, the industrial model, pretended to know. I think this was all sincere. I don't think these people were lying, or I'm not a conspiracy theorist. So I would say I probably miss a few conspiracies. But on the other hand, I see the world a lot more clearly than powerful forces shaping these events. I think in the industrial era, people, I think Stalin probably believed very sincerely that by killing hundreds of thousands of millions of people in the Ukraine, he could improve agriculture and bring social justice in a mode that hadn't been known before. These were sincere people. They were just wrong. And what's happening now is a lot of the sort of pretense to knowledge has been exposed, and that, of course, has contributed to the sort of bleeding away of authority of these institutions.
I'm inclined to somewhat defend authorities and institutions, at least relative to the current kind of zeitgeist. But there's no question that scientists often overstated how much they knew, that journalists just get things wrong all the time, that politicians sometimes are absolute hypocrites. But it's a question of balance between you need to. The institutions are trying to make the best of what are often very tricky situations, but also they need to be perhaps more honest with the public about what they can and can't do.
Well, I would say, in a sense, the public. And then we can talk about what the public is. That's actually a pretty, not an easy answer for that one. But the public, as I define it, is, as I say, mired on negation, almost sometimes to nihilism. But on the other hand, who is it in a democratic country that you can say is responsible for these politicians? I mean, if a person comes to us running for president and says, I think I have something that may improve the situation, but let's try trial and error and see whether it works or not, that guy would never get anywhere. Nobody would vote for that person. If a person says, I'll build a wall, or I'll do this, I'll do that, and that will solve all our problems, suddenly everybody votes for that person. But then you have created a condition where whatever he does, even if he succeeds in doing what he says he's going to do, it's probably not going to address that situation. And then again, the negation flows in.
Yeah, talk a little bit more about this negation issue.
Well, the public today is very different, and I like that you sent me a list of counterfactuals to the revolt of the public. I love them. I love counterfactuals. And one of them was, well, what about 1968? 1968, I remember it, by the way. You don't, but I do.
Yeah.
Was a year of turbulence worldwide. You had it in China, you had it in the US, you had it in France, you had it in Czechoslovakia, all over. And I would say there's a couple of things there, right? The history, the interpretation of events can never rise to the level of a science because you can't control for it, right? I can't run a version of the Arab Spring in which I take away Al Jazeera and the internet and see what happens. All we have is the instance that actually did happen. So there may be very well some kind of deep connection between these turbulent moments in history. That's a subject of research for young people like yourselves. I'm more interested in the differences. And the differences, of course, are that when you look back at what a radical or a revolutionary or a person who made trouble was in those days, they were like a little mirror image of the establishment themselves. In fact, the more revolutionary that you were, the more disciplined and hierarchical that your organization was. And you had an ideology, a very hard ideology, and you had programs that you wanted to impose. And of course, you wanted to impose them. Therefore, you wanted to run the government. So there were all these accepted ambitions of the turbulence of 1968 that is very different from today. Today, the public has no program. It has no ideology or many ideologies. You look at a movement like the Yellow Vests today, or like the Indignados in Spain, and literally they would say everybody could talk for themselves, but somehow having a general ideology was considered to be taboo. They do not want to seize the government. They're not storming the palaces of power. They have no interest in that. So what you have today is a public that is mired in negation, in the sense that it wants the government and the status quo to be completely different, and yet wants not to be involved in that change other than to stand from outside and say, we don't like what's going on. That's pretty unique in history as far as I can tell.
Yeah. So if I understand you correctly, you're saying information technology has made it so easy to kind of challenge any and to question and to criticize kind of any actual concrete proposals that are put forward, such that these revolutionary movements or these political movements today, much more than in the past, are just focused on opposing things and like complaining about like the problems that the current political system is producing, rather than putting forward like concrete policies that would fix it, or putting for or running for office and trying to gain power themselves. They're much less interested in that than protest movements used to be.
Yeah, when you look at all these movements, there's always seems to be a dribble of individuals that eventually migrate over to electoral politics and immediately are sort of like excommunicated by the original radicals, because joining even democratic politics, these are all democratic countries I'm talking about, somehow is selling out. It's you now join the status quo, and that's not what people want. Another aspect of that, too, though, is what Clay Shirky, whose book I think is one of the truly anticipatory documents. So because he wrote it before all these things happened, okay? I had the privilege of watching them happen in CIA. He was just kind of looking into the future and predicting and projecting and got it right. He calls it self-assembling. And so what you had before was, before you could put a crowd on the streets, you needed an organization, you needed a plan, you needed printing presses to have little handouts, a mimeograph machine. That was what I had in 1968. You want to have anti-war. It was a very deeply organized thing. Today, you all meet on Facebook. And so nobody knows you're there. These are mainly, like in France, for example, these are closed Facebook groups. You need to be able to ask to get in there. And at a certain moment, they say, "Let's go on the streets." And suddenly, out of nowhere, according for the elites, out of nowhere comes tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, angry and burning cars and vandalizing banks and so forth. That couldn't be done. Organize, self-assemble a crowd, in Clay Shirky's terms, in the old days. You needed a lot of footwork.
Yeah. So what sorts of people are participating in these new movements?
Every sort, pretty much. I mean, if there is a typical, and I hate to use that because there are many, many counterfactuals there. It tends to be relatively young people, by which I mean mid-30s and under. Tends to be very educated people, college educated mostly. Tends to be relatively affluent people. Hardly ever have there been, in fact, I can't think of a single instance where marginalized, economically marginalized groups or racial or ethnic minorities led one of these groups. Maybe Black Lives Matter would be the exception. almost none of these groups, and Black Lives Matter, when you look at the people who began it, they were, again, these educated, and they were not marginalized human beings. So there is a strain of thought that this is all the product of globalization. And there's no question that when you look at Trump voters, for example, there's a strain of that. When you look at the yellow vests in France, there is a deep strain of that. It's fun to look at their postings. I mean, you see this nice looking gray-haired sort of grandmotherly lady on YouTube basically yelling at Macron for his policies. And you realize that the power of this digital instrument through which we're communicating right now is amazing. It's an amazing thing. How did this woman, and she's famous, I mean, she got millions of hits, become a star in this particular public for articulating exactly what everybody was feeling, even though she was just somebody from the provinces in France.
So I think that something you dwell on a bit in the book is that it is somewhat surprising that often the people who are leading these strident protest movements are themselves people who are doing quite well. They're quite wealthy. Yep. They're not necessarily unemployed at all. They're potentially very educated, like living a lot longer than their parents did.
Yep.
Is that a difference from the past, or is it just the case that like typically protest movements have always been led by kind of people who have the resources and the time to dedicate to political organization?
That's a good question. Probably you're right. I mean, I don't know. I haven't researched that. I think you're probably right. I mean, Lenin was essentially a bureaucratic aristocrat. His family was. But I think the difference is that all of this has been done, it tended to be done in the past on behalf of the disadvantaged. So yes, and with participation from those groups. So yes, when you look at the civil rights movement, it was obviously not the downtrodden sharecroppers that were doing the sit-ins and stuff like that. But the leading edge of it were the Black churches. They were the people who were most intimately concerned with attaining justice in that moment. Whereas now, there's very little of that. There's mainly a sense that the government and the status quo in general is wrong and is distant and is not responsive and is corrupt. And every time something is promised and it doesn't work out, it's never interpreted as incompetence. It's always interpreted as corruption, right? So that adds to the sense that these people pretend to have authority and knowledge, but have none. They're just there for their own benefit. But on the other hand, the public is not putting forward if we do plan A, plan B, or plan C, we'll achieve utopia. I mean, the industrial model, in the end, whether you were in Russia or the United States, had this long utopian view. In the end, we were going to solve all the problems, and all human relationships were going to be somehow smoothed out if we did all the right things, and we were going to achieve utopia. That's been lost. That's not there in the thought of the public today. All there is anger at what people in power are doing, and the wish to kind of change that or erase that in some way, sometimes just to batter it, just to smash at it. I thought it very symbolic that the yellow vests in France were smashing at the Arc de Triomphe, right? Gained nothing by that except a sense of this stands for the system as I know it. I'm just going to smash this statue and vandalize it.
Yeah, I think something that's interesting is in as much as these protest movements are being led by people who on paper seem to be doing quite well, potentially they have jobs, their income is okay, they're not in ill health, they're not being discriminated against per se, it suggests that it's quite a bit harder to solve. Because if it was being led by people who are unemployed and had low incomes, then perhaps we could just hope to have social programs that could fix these things. But in as much as it's people who are actually already doing quite well, it's going to be a lot harder to satisfy them, because perhaps their hopes and aspirations are like beyond what society can provide, just given current technology.
Well, I guess you have to ask yourself, what is it? I mean, you look at the economy right now and the economy since 2008, I think 2008 was a wake-up moment for a lot of people. And I think it was less, and this is speculation, it was less people being thrown out of work, although that was some of that. But there was, for example, no political backlash from that for years. And more a sense of these people in charge have no clue what they're doing, which was what it looked like in 2008. And I think that has percolated down. So if you want to look at how you go around about changing the situation, turning it around in a more positive direction, you have to ask yourself, well, how do you reconcile the public with the system? And I would say a really good way not to do it would be to assume that if you are against the system, you are racist, you are homophobic, you are Islamophobic, you are this, you're that, the other, which seems to be the way the elites respond almost reflexively when they have movements, they see movements that contradict their piety. Just like the public never sees incompetence, always sees vile corruption at the top, right? This is people who are bad people. The elites never see people with genuine grievances. They see bad people who are almost deranged in their passions, I would say. So how do you reconcile them? Well, again, we go back to, I think part of what the public does not like about the current situation is the distance between themselves and their rulers. And by that, I mean the social distance. I mean, it's a really strange thing, Rob, when you think about it. We elect these individuals who were, most of them, normal human beings when they got elected, okay? And it is a case that they go away to Washington, start acting strangely, speak a language that nobody speaks like. I mean, they speak politicese, I guess you could say. Start hiding behind bodyguards and metal detecting machines. Have you ever been to Washington?
I have, yeah. It's
Okay,
imposing.
well,
It feels like the imperial capital, no question.
It's like I mean, I've lived here most of my life. I used to be able to walk into the State Department and, hi, how are you? And I would walk right in. All right. Right now, they stop you a block away from the State Department. And even if you are, as I was, a member of the government, they would stop you a block away from the State Department. And who are you and why are you here? All right. You are almost the enemy by being the public, almost by default. So this is a sense that these people have retreated back there. And okay, if they delivered a society that is one that I am happy with, I might let them get away with it. But people are very unhappy about various things that are happening, and they speak out. And then that distance just basically drowns out their voices. The elites don't hear the public. It's very, very strange. Just like you're always surprised when the public appears on the street. This has happened again and again. You think that they're expected by now. They don't. They just don't see any legitimacy, any existence to the public. So when you have that distance, I mean,
just distrust becomes pretty natural.
Yeah, and you want to cure that. It becomes a question of what is a legitimate elite? How do you arrive at a legitimate elite? And that's of course a very complicated question, and probably you and I could talk about it for hours and not get to an end of it. But a very simple way of looking at it is a truly healthy, genuine elite. The people in it have attributes that everybody else aspire to have. Okay. And that's not that rare. I mean, in my lifetime, people would say you have to be honest like George Washington was, or you have to persevere like Thomas Edison persevered. And I mean, Washington and Edison were probably both pretty thorny characters. And you could pick out their flaws if you want to. But in those days, people preferred to look at that in them that was admirable. All right. And I think we need, and by we, I mean the public. The public selects the elites by turning to them and saying, okay, you do things for us. Who basically live out, are embedded in the narratives that we find to be acceptable. People who are not distant, people who are like us and don't lose themselves in the environment when they get elected, as seems to happen now.
Yeah, so I want to show some degree of self-awareness here by asking, like, where do I fall in this picture, and where do perhaps listeners fall? Because I was thinking, I probably identify as kind of an authority or part of the establishment to a surprising degree, given that I'm not American and like not especially wealthy and don't really have that much political power either. So I feel like I'm part of this group to some extent. And that might seem natural. So of course I'm going to be defensive about these movements challenging like whether I really know what I'm talking about. But I also wonder, like, maybe when I thought about this more, it's like, is it actually the case that me and the listeners to this show are kind of part of the establishment? Because so many of these people who are part of these movements that are against the existing establishment are kind of young people, very educated people who are potentially doing quite well and want to change the world and like create a much better world. It might be that in fact it's like a much more mixed picture, that we're like partly part of the establishment, but partly not. On the other hand, it does seem, I think that the effective altruism community is like very inclined to try to come up with very specific policy, concrete policy proposals for how they would change things, which is perhaps one way in which we wouldn't really fit into these new protest movements very naturally.
Right. Yeah, I get that a lot. Who am I? Elite or public, right? That's a good question. I mean, I was in the U.S. government. It's not like I was there, a mover and a shaker. Like I said, I never got my double O license, but I saw it from inside. I saw, and let me tell you, there are a lot of. I mean, just a very brief example. There is in CIA when you walk in a wall that has stars on it. No names, just stars. These are the people who have died serving their country in CIA. Between the time I joined CIA and the time I left, at least the number of stars had doubled. Okay, at least had doubled, and I found them to be the people I dealt with brilliant, dedicated, hardworking. So this is, I've seen the swamp, so to speak, from the inside, and it's composed of good people, well-meaning people. I suspect the public, when you look at them, it's the same thing. These are people who are good people, well-meaning people. It's structurally they are positioned such that they cannot seem to understand one another. The elites, honestly, when you get to the high reaches at least, seem to like that industrial distance. The industrial model was everything happens from the top down. I have accredited expertise. I probably have gone to very many famous universities and gotten a lot of degrees. I therefore speak in a pseudoscientific language that kind of makes me sound like I really know what I'm talking about. And you, by the way, have none of those attributes. Therefore, why are you even talking to me? You're kind of a deplorable person. So that's what the one side sees. The public structurally seems to be saying, we elected you. You have disappeared into the clouds. You seem to be chasing women or men or whatever, just spending your time doing things that would shame a Hollywood star. You are playing with our money and not doing very well with that. And we want to erase that. We want to batter that. We want to take those institutions that have lifted you so high up and break them down so you can come closer to where we are. And between these 2 points of view, bridges need to be built. And we can discuss how that might happen, but it's not the individuals involved necessarily who are villainous. I started the book, by the way, thinking I had a side. I started the book thinking that I was on the side of the public. And the more I wrote the book, and the more I researched the book, the more I researched the book, the more I realized that there were very many aspects about these movements that I was very uncomfortable with. And they were not I don't have a side on this struggle. I'm just kind of diagnosing it. And I feel like if you see what's going on in these terms, a lot of the words that we use, like liberal and conservative, right? Okay, that's the 19th century British English politics, okay? Or right and left, for God's sakes, as 18th century French politics, okay? These terms put a veil in front of our eyes that prevents us from seeing the reality of what's going on, which is not right or left, conservative or liberal, but there is a structural collision between a digitalized public and industrialized elites.
So I want to get onto hitting you with some potential counter arguments, but just before we get there, just so that the audience has in mind lots of concrete examples that they can have at their fingertips. I guess we've got like the sort of protest movements in France and Spain and I guess Greece. We've got Brexit. We've got kind of the Trump thing. I guess also Bernie Sanders. We've got the whole Arab Spring. Are there any others that people should have in mind as we go on discussing this?
Well, yeah, I mean, it just happened in Brazil.
Brazil.
Venezuela hasn't won, so it doesn't get the big splash. But the Venezuelans have been trying, and they have a big online presence. The opposition there does. There is, of course, in Europe, from Sweden down to Spain, there have been movements that have been basically energized about immigration policies, for example, and Germany as well. Angela Merkel pretty much is a shadow of herself. Angela Merkel, probably her tenure is to be counted now in months and not years. You look at what's happening in Britain with Theresa May, and I mean, they just wrung her through the ringer of a party no confidence vote. She won that, but she still has to get the Brexit vote, and who knows, right? So these European leaders, almost everywhere. The popular ones right now, what is the most popular government in the EU right now? Let me ask you.
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, I guess like Angela Merkel is like moderately popular. So I guess that's maybe the best you can do at the moment.
It's tricky. I'd say probably the Italian government. The Italian government is two populist parties that are as different as a cat and a dog, okay? And they have somehow coalesced into a government. And they are, of course, very anti-status quo, very anti-everything that's happened before. Anti the EU, so far they have not been irresponsible about it. They have just been pushing back on the EU, pushing back on immigration. They don't want immigration. They have a 68% approval rating in Italy, which is pretty astounding in this day and age. Probably won't last because these things don't tend not to last, but it's pretty amazing. And I was in Italy recently, and I had my Thomas Friedman moment. When you step into, I don't know if you ever read Thomas Friedman.
Yeah, no, I'm familiar.
I have to admit I've stopped, but his articles tend to invariably begin with, "Well, I took a taxi cab in Yemen or something," and then so the taxi cab the cabbie pretty much explains the situation to you. Well, I had my Thomas Friedman moment in Rome, where the taxi cab driver was playing this political radio basically, and it was left-wing political radio. And so I asked him what he felt like, and he gave me that kind of a mushy answer. So I said, "Well, so are you optimistic or pessimistic?" And he said, "I'm Italian." He says, "I'm disgusted." Okay. So that is the public, right? For a government to have 68% approval rating when the default is disgusted is pretty amazing. So I would say this is something that is happening. I mean, you mentioned in your counterfactuals places like Canada and so forth where it hasn't happened, but it's happening in more places than we even talked about here.
Yeah, so there's the 5-star movement in Italy. I guess so. Yeah, so what do you say about countries like Canada or Australia or New Zealand, or I guess Japan, China, maybe even, where like people seem at least like moderately satisfied with their governments, and there haven't been like large protest movements. Is it just a matter of time, or is it the case that there's like different dynamics in different places?
Yeah, China, let's put aside. That is
that's just kind of its own thing.
Very inscrutable country. The others, well, here's what I believe. What I believe is each country has its own culture and its own traditions and its own history and its own habits and its own default modes of dealing with events and crises and situations. My framework gets overlaid on that. Okay, it's not. I am not like Karl Marx, who believes that the class struggle is inevitable and the rise of the proletariat is inevitable. Revolution is inevitable. I believe quite the opposite of that. I have come to believe that nothing is inevitable. Nothing can be predicted in human events. So there may well be local reasons for why a Canada or an Australia hasn't seen a movement like Occupy Wall Street or the Tea Party or the Brexit crowd in Britain or the Yellow Vests in France. It could also mean that tomorrow it might happen there. I don't know. If their local situation, the dial is turned in a certain way, and all that I'm saying is this framework is there in every country. Every country that has access to the digital world, that's almost every country today, with about maybe 4 exceptions, where if there is a problem, I mean, there was no problem in France until suddenly there was. I mean, that literally happened within weeks. So for all we know, there are people in Canada who are meeting on Facebook right now and saying, "Damn, we're going to have to get together and do whatever, get those SOBs in the government, show them what they need to be shown, or not."
Do we actually know whether like the number of street protests and the level of dissatisfaction with governments is higher than before? Because of course there's been lots of protests, lots of like somewhat revolutionary movements throughout history. There was like more communists and anarchists in the past than there are typically today. So it's not entirely obvious that things are more turbulent than they were through 1950 through 1990.
I 100% agree. I 100% agree. And I mean, in the olden days, there were groups that were dedicated. I mean, there were tiny little hierarchies whose job it was to create disturbances, right? That doesn't really happen anymore. These things really are sort of as close to being unplanned as you can be. I think that number-wise, no, probably not. I haven't studied that. I haven't seen any study that has counted those things, but my gut feeling is that it probably in numbers, no.
Yeah, okay. So you're not necessarily saying that there's like more protest movements in the past. It's just that their nature has changed. They're more spontaneous. They're more just against things rather than putting things forward. And they can they can appear and disappear like very, very rapidly because the public can organize itself and like develop its own ideas very fast.
Yeah, with the speed of light, literally. I mean, and you look at the digital world, you can create a Facebook page, as happened in Egypt, that is an oppositional Facebook page, and you can say, let's have a meeting, let's get together in Tahrir Square on 25 January of 2011, and several pages did that, and tens of thousands of people showed up, and the rest is history, literally. So that couldn't happen before.
Yeah. So this whole kind of model that you have of what's going on, sounds very plausible when I was reading the book. It seems like it could be right, but I worry that it's like quite easy to kind of spin a narrative that seems to explain what's going on, just given that there's like not that many data points and it's so hard to understand the whole world. So kind of lots of different things can sound plausible. So I'm curious to like push on this a little bit. It's like how do we know that it is the internet which is kind of driving this rather than some other phenomenon? And I think sometimes people can be a little bit too credulous that just accepting arguments that the internet has changed things. For example, there's this whole idea of filter bubbles that like people are just end up reading their own like extremist content again and again and only getting exposed to articles that they agree with. But I've read like decent evidence that this is kind of a myth, that by and large people actually mostly get they get more dissonant, more conflicting information on the internet than they do in real life, and that they used to get in before the internet. So yeah, how do we really know that it's kind of the internet or social media that's doing these things rather than some other phenomenon?
Well, let's put it in a laboratory, take out the internet and see what happens. We can't know. We can't know. I would say if the framework that I provide, you can give ideas and projections of what would happen if it was not the way that my thesis seems to be indicating. And you can say, well, if the thesis is really what I think it is, then these other things would happen. The book has taken off in essence because those things that the thesis seemed to be indicating have come to pass. I mean, the real big moment for my book, my best friend is Donald Trump, because when he got elected, everybody said, oh my God, Martin Gurri predicted this. Well, I didn't. I mean, there was no mention of him in the book, although there is now because I wrote an essay for the new edition. But there were those projections of what would happen if this was if my thesis really was the case. Now, whether underneath my thesis it's the internet, well, I mean, human events are very complex. It's not just the internet. That's a pretty obvious thing. It's the fact that we are coming down from an industrial model that pretended to knowledge that it didn't have, that had command and control systems that were probably the most efficient and therefore most controlling and most hierarchical that we have ever known in history, and probably any number of other events, 2008 being one, for example, the big economic crisis, and any number of others that play into this. Human events are by nature complex. I only feel like there is, if you tease out one aspect of what is happening now that is different from anything that's happened in history before, all right, it's that tsunami chart. And when you think about institutions that are based on much tinier pots of information, each controlled by some elite institution, and the fact that the tsunami has just swept over it and just basically bashed them, that strikes me as the most significant change from the past. Is it the only one? Obviously not. Can I positively prove? Only when, I mean, eventually it will be disproven. Every assertion you make about an event, any interpretation of human events, eventually is disproven. And it's a hypothesis, it's a thesis. I think it explains the world we live in. It clarifies it. I think people live right now in a state of confusion and frustration because there's so much noise, so mumuch turbulence. And they go back then to their, well, I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, and it doesn't seem to somehow explain anything, okay? And I hope anyway that the thesis in my book can shed some light as to what is actually happening. And then you can still go back to being a Republican or a Democrat, a liberal or a conservative, but you have to add this added dimension to it.
So people might be skeptical that new communications technology could really revolutionize society and politics. But I think that the standard view is that like past changes in communications technology have had revolutionary impacts. Like the alphabet, made it possible to have like big social structures in a way that was much more difficult before. We've got like the printing press. People think that caused potentially a lot of conflict within Europe and the Protestant Reformation. Then you've got like radio. People think supported kind of totalitarian social structures because it was kind of from one point you could broadcast to everyone. Do you want to talk a little bit about the history here and why we should maybe expect that the internet could have really revolutionary implications?
Yeah. And implications is good. I don't use the word cause because, of course, every human transition, it has many, many causes. These are technological changes that enable social and political change. May do it, may not, but the cause obviously may be political, social, and it could come from many different directions. And at a certain point, it occurred to me that when you look at this, many books that have been written on this, the history of communications, there was a certain kind of society that depended on the hieroglyph. China was kind of on the same model, and you needed mandarins for them, people who had been trained very deeply in how to write this very complex set of symbols so you could actually keep records that then a very top-down government, which was not possible until then, could use to maintain order. The alphabet made possible the classical republics, Greece and Rome. You could not have had those republics without a fairly literate public, and you couldn't have had that without an alphabet. Did the alphabet cause democracy in Athens? No, it just made it possible. It just made it possible. It was a technological breakthrough that was seized by these very brilliant people at that moment in Athens and turned it to their advantage in the invention of democracy. The printing press, honestly, I think was a bigger thing than the internet and the digital revolution. I think the printing press may have been the biggest because suddenly what had been a very small trickle of written materials became a flood. And if you read a lot of the elites of those days, they sound even more hysterical than the elites of our days. It's like, what the heck? Why are these people writing these books? They don't know anything about anything, and yet they can publish a book. Who's going to stop that? And of course, governments set up these very elaborate censorship mechanisms, but there was always another country somewhere outside that wanted to stick it to that country, and they would set up the printing presses, and the material would still make it there. And as you say, it didn't create the scientific revolution. I mean, you think about trying to maintain information being conveyed about scientific experiments with handwritten scrolls. I mean, that's just an entirely different order of problem than with being published. It enabled that. It enabled the French Revolution. It enabled the American Revolution. It didn't create any of those things, but it enabled them. So it was probably, in my mind, the most revolutionarily turbulent technological change. After that, you had mass media. And mass media came at a moment when, that moment in the industrial age that I keep talking about, hundreds of millions of people entered basically history. I mean, what I mean by that is they had lived in their little valleys and their little pockets and not changed dramatically since the Middle Ages. Suddenly, the ideal of equality was made very important. The idea that there's several books about this as well, where people from the countryside and from the lower parts of the economic range were made into citizens. They had to be educated. They had to be taught certain ideals about who they were, what their politics were supposed to be like. But mass media was a very top-down method. It was a very top-down method. In the end, it was I'm going to educate you method. And so I, the expert, will tell you how to behave. And here's a newspaper which gets published in one little place somewhere. But that's all the news all the news is fit to print. You don't need to look at anything else. Here it is, right? And then you have our current digital model, which is very flat, very fast, very transient. People think that everything, the young people who worry that their naked pictures are going to last forever and haunt them in their careers, the thing that's most remarkable about digital information is how transient it is. A lot of it just goes away. Formats change, and when the formats change, whole reams of information goes away. Look around my house, and I have discs that look like nothing on earth. I don't know what would play those discs anymore. I have no idea what's in those discs. It's gone. So this very fast, very transient allows you to give vent to your opinions in a very fast and very immediate way that now collides with that old mass media, the industrial way of basically commanding society. And where this is going to go, it's very early days. I mean, the web was late 90s, late 90s. It seems like it's been here forever. Probably for you it has been, but for me, not so. And history works even today when it seems like everything is sped up. And I think actually there's some data to show that it really has sped up. But even so, social and political changes work slowly. They work slowly. So where we're headed with this, I don't know, but it's going to be already, I can tell, there's, fasten your seatbelts. There's turbulence ahead.
Yeah, so I thought one piece of evidence that you could potentially, use to bolster your argument might be to look at the individual level. Is it people who are using these new like information technologies and like absorbing these new sources of information, who are the ones who are most likely to be dissatisfied and distrustful and part of these new political movements? So, for example, you might find that, say, low-income people are like less likely to use the internet, and perhaps they're also the least likely to be disillusioned, which would be like paradoxical and might like, but would like be potentially explained by your thesis.
I mean, that what you just said there is 100% the case. Whether that necessarily that supports the thesis, I think it is somewhat, but there's no question that these movements are begun by individuals who are masters of the digital conversation, all right? And you don't get to be that way if you don't own a computer, if you don't have a connectivity. Usually that comes along with some kind of higher education. And you look at some of these movements like Occupy Wall Street, which were really, in terms of individuals who joined, it was a very tiny movement. It was huge because it had this online presence, this clever way of, the 99% versus the 1%. They had big a campaign in which people would show with a little card what being part of the 99% meant. They had a resonance way beyond their numbers because they were so brilliant at manipulating the digital conversation. And these were all people who were not marginalized. These were mostly college-educated individuals.
So I've seen some evidence that, at least for the pro-Trump movement, the people involved were more likely to be using cable news than using the internet, or at least like relative to people with other political views. I'm not sure how strong that evidence is. Perhaps it's wrong. But yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about how, say, cable news fits into this argument? Was that kind of a precursor to the internet, but you think it also created like similar effects?
Yeah, I mean, not just cable news, but satellite. I think that trajectory that I talked about when I was sitting in my analyst chair at CIA, watching the global media slowly go crazy. The very first explosion of information was not digital in the sense of the internet. There was no internet yet. It was television. Somehow or another, television became kind of like a symbol of a modern country. If you had good television, you were a modern country. And if you were a primitive country, then you had what the Egyptians had in 1980, which was 2 channels that were literally all Mubarak all the time. I mean, it was just deadly. So a man like Hosni Mubarak, dictator, he wants his country to be modern. So bring in the channels, right? Bring in the channels. 10 years later, there were 400 channels, and you could get almost anything in Cairo that you wanted to in terms of television from anywhere in the world, including the state televisions from Libya, where it was all Gaddafi all the time, okay? So basically, television is probably to this day the most powerful medium. One of the really interesting changes that I actually researched some, and I wish I had had the time to research more, is the fact that what we call the digital age is in some ways the victory of the image over the printed word. People tend to look at YouTube and television, regular television of many kinds. The Al Jazeeras of the world, for example, had a just tremendous impact. They said words that had never been heard of on television in many countries. So that, I think, yes, television had and has an enormous impact. I think it's fracturing, as everything else is today. It's fracturing along many different ways. And when you look at the numbers of cable news in the United States, I am really people tend to ascribe demonic powers to Fox News. I mean, they hit 4 million viewers on a really good week, okay? We have 320 million people in this country. That's not a lot. So, and of course, MSNBC and CNN are less than that. So if you add them all up together, it's not very many. So yes, they are part of the package. And I think in the Trump era, they seem to be like echo chambers almost to all the noise that's going on elsewhere. But it's not a significant player, I don't think.
So what are your points is that the public is more nihilistic than before, more just against rather than for anything. But how sure are we that that's true? Because it seems like, for example, Bernie Sanders has, quite a significant platform. His supporters like things like Medicare for all. Trump wants to build the wall. He's got at least some specific policy proposals. He wants to have tariffs on China, that kind of thing. The Brexit people, they were in favor of leaving the EU. That's a specific policy proposal. I guess you might say it's more about what they're against than what they're for. But that's often the case with opposition movements in the past. I would imagine that it's easier to corral people to be against something than to tell them exactly what they're in favor of. So I'm wondering, how do we know that there really has been a shift here?
Well, I mean, I really do think that all those examples, the people that joined were very much motivated by what they were against, very much motivated by what they were against. And when you look at what they write, they don't write about the magnificent Sanders vision for the future. They write about the things that they want to obliterate and to leave behind. I mean, there's a big trail, both digitally and paper, of these people writing about their movements that they have joined. And in many cases, from the Indignados and the Yellow Vests, they have nothing they advocate. I mean, there really is. You cannot pin them down to say, give me one thing that you want done. They will say things, they will start spouting things that they would like to happen, but there's none that the entire group has gathered around. And oftentimes they're very contradictory. I think the 10 city protesters in Israel wanted, for example, to abolish tuition and to increase the pay of college professors. So you go, okay, how's that going to work out? So it was just make it a perfect world is what they were saying. So my feeling is that they are very much motivated by what they're against. These individuals like Sanders provide a vehicle for that. Sanders gives a kind of an old-timey socialist face to that negation. But I saw very little in terms of what people were saying on that side, and more what they were saying of what they were trying to change away from.
Yeah, I guess I'd be very interested to see some case studies of other protest movements in the past and see to what extent they were united by what they're against versus what they were for. I guess it seems like you might be right, but I suppose I also it's possible that protest movements in the 20s and 30s also really focused on negation because that's just easier.
Yeah, no, I actually. I think you're right. And I mean, I remember long ago doing a lot of research on Marxist and communist movements and the big names in the ideology, and realizing, having that exact realization, is that they were a little sketchy on what was going to happen when they took over, but they were really sharply focused on the injustices of the moment. Yeah. So I mean, and maybe it's a human thing. I think it's in this particular case, there isn't even, in most cases, an elaborated ideology, an elaborated set of programs that stand as, well, in the end, if we win, this is what we want to do. And bear in mind that many of these people, many of these movements are not even interested in taking power. Power to them is corrupt. It's essentially corrupt. So they don't want to participate in that. They want power to decorrupt itself in some way that is never explained. And then you get to, well, change the tax or do this or do the other. There's specific grievances that they immediately fasten on to. But yeah, so that would be it.
So I guess another oddity, or at least something that seems kind of inconsistent with your theory, is that I've looked at opinion polling on just a wide range of different questions that I'll stick up links to. And it seems across a whole bunch of issues like, support for trade, enthusiasm about immigration, attitudes to guns and abortion and levels of taxes. The average level of opinion is actually remarkably stable over the last 10, 20, even 30 years. It's most people remain moderately enthusiastic about trade in the US even today when Donald Trump is bashing it, and this is kind of a big political issue where it didn't used to be. I suppose I think there probably has been a bit more of a splintering where the parties are now more polarized than they used to be. It used to be that 2/3 of people in both the Democrats and Republicans were mildly pro-trade, whereas now it's they've kind of diverged. But how does the stability on public polling on these questions fit with your theory?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I was a young man during the Vietnam War, and consistently consistently until almost the very end, a majority of young people at that time supported the war. But if you were to say what imprinted my generation, the boomers, it was not the people who sat at home and said, yeah, the survey guy said, yeah, I support that. It were the people who went out to the streets and made a noise. And there were many. Let me tell you, I was here in Washington, and I would participate in one or two, and you could see we were all nonconformists. I remember standing in this ocean of blue jeans. We all, my now wife, who was then my girlfriend, said, "Look at us. We're all identically dressed." Right?
We're all nonconformists now.
Millions of nonconformists all wearing blue jeans. All right, there was maybe a million in that particular one, and that's what defined my generation. It defined who we are. The people who were had the poll numbers are forgotten today, and I think, yeah, I think there is a difference between what people feel and think and what the events of the day are. And I think what I'm talking about is events. And sometimes the events fly in the face of even the reality. There's a whole lot of talk, for example, about how globalization is driving a lot of this discontent and basically elected Trump. I mean, look at our unemployment numbers. They're wonderful unemployment numbers. I have lived through much worse. You look at education numbers, you look at life expectancy at every group. And the ones improving the most tend to be the ones at the bottom or the ones that have been marginalized. So if you wanted to say this is the best of all possible worlds, you could say that, but nobody's saying that. Nobody is saying that. They're saying the opposite. It's the worst. And they are basically out in the streets, and they have seized the stage. So I think the age is going to be defined not by the good economic numbers, but by the people who are saying we don't like what's going on.
I guess one synthesis would be that, the median person might feel pretty similarly, but like the people who are influencing the perceptions are the 5 or 15% who are like most dissatisfied and most vocal, and their attitudes have shifted quite a bit.
Yeah.
And their ability to communicate has changed quite a lot.
Yes, I think that the number of people who can participate has changed dramatically. The way that they can participate has changed dramatically. And eventually, the clay shirky self-assembly, you can push a button on your laptop, and the next day you are one of tens of thousands demonstrating the people you have never met before. Okay? How could that have been possible 35 years ago? It could not have been. Today is a pretty common occurrence.
Yeah, so I'm curious to know, what evidence do you think would refute your view? Or maybe what are the best arguments you could come up with if you were trying to challenge the perspective that you're proposing?
Well, I mean, if you had a public respect for the institutions that run our lives or that frame our lives, if you within the institutions themselves had that sort of, I don't know what to call it, but a sense of sporting fair play where you are no longer a resistance, really. You are the loyal opposition, for example. If the pitch of our politics were not so apocalyptic, were more institutional, more policy-driven, more like it used to be, and if whenever the president spoke, there would tend to be kind of a gathering behind him and saying, well, okay, let's listen to what he's got to say. All these things, when all these things begin to happen, you will know that my thesis was completely false, okay? Unfortunately, I don't see that happening anytime soon. But yes, the industrial world had a moment, and it was a moment where hundreds of millions of people basically entered history. So it was not like you could say it was an anti-democratic moment. It just was democracy at a very different model than what we have today. And that has lasted in some form unto this day. But our social model is a lot flatter. So we can get a date at the click of a button. I wish I were a young man today. I mean, it's a lot easier than it used to be. You can buy a car at the click of a button. But if you want a passport, you got to take weeks. If you want a building permit, you probably have to wait years. Okay. And, if you go to an ER room, it takes you a day to get looked at, So the institutions seem to be moving at a different pace of response than the public is used to in its social and commercial existence. And that social and commercial existence, I think, has created certain expectations of government that may well be utopian. I don't know. It probably are. But they are there. I expect the government to treat me the way that Amazon does, which is when I want something, they give me, oh yeah, you like that? Here's something else you might like, okay? And not like take a line and go to the metal detector and take off your hat and salute, knuckle your forehead at me, salute me and wait your turn. We're not used to that, but that was the industrial way of being. The people at the top got respect, the people below them got respect by the people below, and those of us who were at the very bottom then respected everybody and accepted what they said. And it worked as long as they could maintain the basically command the conversation. They had the information available to us came from them.
Are there any countries that you find kind of hard to fit into your theory where you're like, oh, maybe this is kind of a counterexample, or maybe there's obviously other dynamics going on, and this is an example of something that's like not what I would have predicted?
Less that than China. I just wish I knew more about what's going on in there, because China has a gigantic online, just probably the largest online presence in the world. Very active, very clever. There are all kinds of clever ways in which to get around all their limitations, but also a whole lot of self-censorship, a whole lot of probably thinking that the government that they have, while pretty terrible in some ways, has made prosperity possible and not wanting to play with that. I don't know. China is one that perplexes me a little bit. I'd like to think it's because there's not enough knowledge. Certainly, I don't have enough knowledge, and I've looked somewhat. I'm not a Chinese expert, though, and I can't read the language. So keep an eye on China. It strikes me as a kind of an anomaly in some ways.
Yeah. I guess one country that I feel is a little bit in tension with the model you're putting forward is actually Spain, which you talk about a whole bunch. So I feel like there was a lot of street protests, a lot of anger, but the magnitude of the recession that they had and its persistence was incredible. Like unemployment there peaked at 26%. Like youth unemployment was approaching 50%. And so it seems like not too surprising that there would be some outcry there. And yet it seemed to kind of die away, and policy and politics there overall seems to have remained remarkably sensible. We currently, still have a center-right party in place. Given the magnitude of what people went through there, it's kind of surprising that there almost wasn't a larger revolutionary change, or there wasn't more dissatisfaction. And even I think there was two big new parties that appeared. I think Podemos and Ciudadanos.
Yes. Yes.
And to be honest, both, I mean, I'm certainly no Spain expert, but they both seem kind of like sensible parties to me, like certainly within the realm of, normal opinion. So I'm kind of curious to know, do you think that like Spain maybe isn't like the archetypal case?
Well, I did a lot of research on Spain. Number one, a lot of those numbers were on a very high base. There was always a lot of youth unemployment in Spain, way higher than anywhere else in the EU. Number two, the protests happened in 2011. That was 3 years after the crisis. Number three, I mean, I've been in Spain since. It looks pretty damn prosperous to me. That could be a superficial impression, but the statistics are it's back to where it was before 2008. My sense of the indignados was that 2008 was part of it, but was not a leading part. The political system that they had, which, as my interpretation of it in the book is that this was very fragmented, with a lot of local authority and then a lot of EU authority in terms of the currency. So the central government actually was squeezed from the top and from the bottom, and so the two main parties, the socialists and the conservatives, had to more or less agree on the big picture, and they did. They disagreed about social policy and whether to be in the Iraq War, but mainly they agreed about the EU, they agreed about the euro, they agreed about capitalism, they agreed about democracy, and to the people who took to the streets in 2011, that looked like collusion. That looked like these people basically are profiting. That there's no difference, and there really was very little between one group or another. There is no listening to us and to our pain, and there was some economic pain, no question about that. But I always feel in these movements that hit the street, there is a sense of listen to us. I mean, you see that really strongly in the Yellow Vest. But I think the indignados were probably the most that had the sense of nobody claims to represent us actually does. And so one of their mottos was, "You don't represent me." That was you may be my representative, but you don't represent me. And I am not anti-system. They were full of clever slogans. I am not anti-system. The system is anti-me, they said. there was a sense that nobody was listening to them. There was that sense of distance and failure at the top. And I think that was a bigger motivator. I think that 2008 was part of the failure, no question about that. But I don't think that was the main driver. I mean, you would have expected the trouble to have started in 2008, 2009. It took 3 years. And it started with a flash, and it ended with a dribble, as these things tend to.
I guess another point you make is that it's perhaps surprising that people who were participating in the protests, who were like relatively well off by Spanish standards, were not more appreciative of the enormous progress that Spain had made over the 40 years since Franco fell in 1975. That like Spain had actually really pushed ahead, become like quite a wealthy country. I think one of the longest lived in the world. So
yeah. I mean, in 2011, the average person in Spain, the very young person in Spain, was better off and had more freedom and had more social openness than I would say any previous time in their history. They were a privileged generation. Yeah, they've been hit on the jaw by 2008, and unemployment was not what it should have been, and there was a housing issue. So it was not a perfect world, but you had people, as I show in the book, saying, some of these indignados saying, well, our parents, they thought they were happy just because they could vote for a government. We're of the first generation that isn't grateful for that. And you go, well, where are you going with this, right? Where would you be going if you're not grateful for voting for a democratic government? What is it exactly that you would put in its place? And of course, they never attempted to, even remotely attempted to discuss that.
Yeah. So Tyler Cohen wanted me to ask, so are people also more disillusioned now with like sports heroes and actors? Because that seems like your theory would also predict that it wouldn't just be disillusion with like politics, but also just with kind of all prominent figures. Is that the case? And if not, why not?
That's a hard thing to measure. I'll give you a very speculative answer, but I actually believe this, and I believe that if I could research it, I could prove it probably. I think part of the ethos of this public that tends to build around certain events is a very, very profound cynicism that goes with the anger. Okay, is always assuming the worst of your opponent. That is, as you know, the internet mode, right? I mean, there is no internet discussion about politics that's halfway salient that doesn't end with somebody threatening somebody's life. Okay, I mean, it's just amazing how that happens. So I would say that we look for those things that in the people who are rich and famous, which demean them, bring them down to our level. Formerly, people were very different. As I said before, we used to talk about George Washington being, honest and so forth. Watch 2 movies. So that's not just actors and not just sports figures, which of course today we know way too much about them. In the old days, we knew hardly anything, and so we could fantasize. Today, part of the information tsunami is these people are out there almost usually literally naked to the world. Okay, so watch 2 movies in succession. I did this at one point. One is called Young Edison, and it is Mickey Rooney, of all people. I don't even know if you know who he is, but he was very well known in his day, a little guy. He was very young then, and he played the young Tom Edison. And it was essentially this little guy who came from nowhere and persevered. And it ends with still his being young. So he's not famous yet, but you can tell he's going to be famous because he's got these wonderful qualities in him, right? Then after that, watch The Social Network, which is almost the exact same story. This guy from nowhere goes to Harvard, comes up with this thing, and suddenly he's a billionaire, right? Except he becomes a billionaire by being a jerk, all right? Now, you might want to say whatever you want about the qualities, the actual personal qualities of Edison versus Zuckerberg. But what we look for is he's a jerk. He's no better than I am. What people were looking for back in the I think it was the 30s, maybe the 40s, when that movie was made of Edison, was somebody to admire, somebody to look up to, somebody who had qualities that were, I could model myself on. And I think today we, as part of the internet culture, which is everything ends in a death threat, we tend to be very cynical and we know too much and we're too cynical, I would say. It's a long answer, but I can't prove it, but I bet you if I researched that, I could.
I guess one difference is that sports heroes don't exercise authority over people to the same degree, so there's perhaps less need to resent them. Yeah, another question that Tyler has was he pointed out that Ethiopia and I guess some other countries as well banned the internet in in most of the countries like outside of the capital city for quite a long time, and that's a policy that was recently changed. But what do you think? Was there a certain wisdom to this, at least from some people's perspectives?
Well, if you want to hold on to power, maybe, I don't know. Hosni Mubarak, to go back to Egypt, of course, in his moment of panic, switched off the internet. It was too late for him there. In the book, I make it pretty clear that although there's a certain usefulness in talking about old media and new media and the internet and newspapers or whatever, in fact, what we're exposed to, what that tsunami is all those things together. It's what I call the information sphere. And the information sphere, you have to be at North Korea levels of control to keep out. I mean, even the Cubans can't keep it out anymore. I don't know Ethiopia. I can't tell whether they are at those levels of either underdevelopment or political repression. But I can guarantee you that if somebody has a dish in Ethiopia, they can get a lot of information, and it's not going to stay in one place. So the internet is one thing. The information sphere is another. The information sphere is very redundant. It's beyond the power of any government to keep out unless you want to impose North Korea levels of repression. All right. So the idea of keeping out the internet, I think I wrote you an email. When I was posted to Paraguay with the U.S. government, I arrived there and the Paraguayan Senate was debating very furiously whether the internet was a good thing or a bad thing. All right. And I mean, to an outsider like me, that was astounding. Paraguay at that time, probably to some extent even now, was a very isolated country, not very well off. There were not any public libraries there. There were very few bookstores. Little newspapers were not of tremendously high quality. Information was hard to get at. And suddenly you had the possibility of opening this immense world, access to every Paraguayan citizen who could afford a connection to the world of information that they had been denied to them before. Why would you not do it? And that was one of the first moments where it clicked in my head. Oh, wait, these are not the people who would have access. These are the people who are in charge of the government. And they're asking themselves, what's going to happen if we say, yes, you can have all this information? And I thought that was kind of an interesting insight. They did do the right thing and allow internet. So I had internet the 2 years I was there. But the fact that they debated it pretty furiously, I thought was very interesting.
So in the book, you make an impressive effort to be descriptive rather than normative, to not to try to actually just like understand what's happening before you pass judgment on it. But I'm curious now, like, do you think overall we're better off for these changes? And like, what are some of the places we've gained?
I had an aunt who always said she wanted to live in the Middle Ages, and she was very unhappy with the modern world. All right, I never understood people like that. I think all the changes. I mean, when you add them all up, it's hard to say good or bad, but the wonderfulness of what has changed, the ability to communicate across the world. You and I are doing so right now in a way that would have just completely freaked me out, 10, 15 years ago. Okay. The amounts of information about places that are not necessarily salient to important people or to important media. You can access information about anywhere in the world. The communications, 4 billion people got on an airplane in the year 2017 and flew somewhere. I mean, that is not the way things used to be. Only rich people were able to afford that in the old days. So no, I think good or bad, I mean, you have to at the end make a judgment. If you want a personal judgment from me, I think I wouldn't go back. I wouldn't turn the dial back one second. I think this is all. We have to learn how to deal with this. We have to learn how to live in the world that we have created. And the book, I hope, describes that world very crisply and provides a few hints as to how we can live that way without tearing each other apart in a fairly pointless manner, I think.
So I want to spend a bit of time now thinking about what implications this has for our listeners who overwhelmingly are interested in using their career and their lives to improve the world. So it seems like one obvious implication that occurred to me is that it seems like this is a glorious time if what you want to do is try to stop things from happening. That it's like maybe hard to put forward a constructive agenda, but if you're interested in influencing politics to just like prevent something, then it's like easy to corral people to negate things. And perhaps there's like some really good opportunities here. That it's like there's bad things that are happening, and you can like go in and like start a movement to stop them much more easily than before. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think as a statement of fact, I think that's correct. I would just be a contrarian there and say I actually think what's needed is the opposite of that. I think what's needed, and I think people who are just now starting of their career have a chance to do, if they want to adapt our institutions to the actual world we're living in, is learn to talk in a language that can't be falsified almost immediately. Learn to talk in careful terms of we think we can do this, or we hope we can do this. We can try this, or then we can try that. This is all very unglamorous, very unglamorous. If you can say, my gosh, I got the ultimate solution, or I'm so against you that I'm going to lead a demonstration of 1 million people and I'm going to eliminate this tax or whatever, that's a lot more glamorous. But that's not what we need. That's happening right now. And in the end, it leads to a dead end. It leads to nihilism.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think a lot of listeners will be involved in kind of the policy conversation. Many of them may go into politics themselves. And I think you say in the book, the reformers of democracy must learn to say out loud for all to hear, this is a process of trial and error, and we're uncertain about the consequences. And even I was wrong, which is like very difficult for politicians to do these days.
It's impossible.
Yeah, yeah. I guess how can we like get to a point where people view the system and politicians as legitimate and respectable, given just the competitive pressures against being honest about the limits of your power and knowledge that they currently make it so hard to say those things.
Well, if you think of your politicians, of the elites, as being an entirely different species from yourself, then almost everything they do you can dismiss and say, well, that's them. This is not me. What we need, obviously, is for elites to behave the way they behaved before they became elites. What we need for them is for the public and the elites to feel like they belong to the same tribe. For that, the people that are part of your audience, who hopefully many of them will become elites, need to rehearse their humility. Humility is a hard art to learn. I have always found that. I found that the older I get, the more humble I become. I knew everything when I was about 30, and I know nothing right now. Okay, I mean, I basically can support some arguments, but I feel like there is so much that is perplexing, and so we can't stop life to figure everything out. Life is not a laboratory. It has to be addressed as it is, and therefore there's a lot of ignorance built into every decision that gets made. That gets washed out of the discussion somehow. The rhetoric is certain. The reality is uncertain. Well, I think if we start to bring some of that, which is really more of a scientific approach, so the humility and uncertainty to political discourse, you will find fewer people will say, well, you promised us this and you completely failed. You said that you could do it, but you couldn't. You promised this gigantic thing and instead you gave us a mess. This seems to happen all the time. That change is a generational change, number one, and it's an institutional change. I honestly think the elites we have in charge right now are not capable of doing it. I mean, when you look at their behavior and you go, these guys like it the way it is. They like the metal detecting machines. They like the bodyguards. They like the limos. That's what being an elite is all about for them. But that puts them at another species from the public. We need people for whom all of that is not necessary and who go back to being what, I mean, let's face it, there wasn't that long ago that going into government meant, serving national interests, serving some particular ideology, some particular set of beliefs. You're hard pressed to understand what the beliefs of, other than just kind of stamped out, right, left, conservative, liberal, what the beliefs are of these people that are in front of our cameras all the time. They're basically they consume the conversation, the political conversation. So I would say if you're young, the easy path is what you said. There was a Charlie Chaplin movie where a truck with a red flag at the end drops the red flag, and he runs up to the truck showing it, and then he turns a corner and like a Charlie Chaplin movie, and suddenly there's like 1 million people behind him that were in some kind of demonstration, and he's waving the red flag, and so he looks like he's some kind of radical leader waving his red flag. Well, that's very easy to do. Basically, if you want to be against, you can wave your red flag, and you can probably get an audience. I think the hard thing to do, the courageous thing to do, is to look in the eye what we really know and what we can really say. If you're proposing certain policy changes or directions, what you can say, and you can say, well, I think, I believe, but these are the possibilities. Assume that the public is as intelligent as you are. That is an assumption that is never made, okay, or rarely made. And be humble in what you propose. Phrase it in such a way that it doesn't sound like you have a mathematical solution, what is really a human condition.
Yeah, okay. So it sounds like you're saying if listeners want to go into politics, they should try to be like really authentically kind of an ordinary person who talks to like voters all the time and isn't a world apart, and they speak the language of voters, and they don't view themselves as better than everyone else. That's like a path that's like both likely to be healthier for democracy and also potentially successful for them, and then might give them the discretion to be able to say things like I don't honestly know the answer to this, whereas currently I guess elites are just expected to promise the world.
I mean, if you look at how authority works online versus how authority works in the industrial model, it's very different. The industrial model, you get it. And once you get it, you have it, right? You're at the top of some hierarchy and you have this authority and it's kind of given to you because of who you are. Online, it's every day. So if you have a person you look online that connects you to stuff that you find interesting, if he has a bad week, you're not looking at that guy anymore. If he gives you bad links that you don't like, so every day you have to say,
you have to earn
what is it? Yeah, you have to earn it every day. I think our politicians are going to have to learn that lesson. We are now in that kind of digital world where you have to earn it. And yeah, I think the young in particular will play a big role in this, because it's my sense of it is, if there's a model for the elites of the generation in charge right now, and some of those are boomers, many of them are Gen Xers, it's Harvey Weinstein. It's a guy like that, a person who basically is self-inflated with feelings of how virtuous he is. Well, he's doing horrible things in secret. And everybody knew it. Everybody knew he was doing this. And nobody said a thing. That kind of confirms all the conspiracy theorists that there's all this horrible corruption at the top and that they all are kind of protecting each other. I think there probably is a little bit of truth to that. But that image has got to be overtaken by I'm not some big mogul. I'm not a big, powerful politician. I'm a citizen like everybody else who happens to be serving the public.
Yeah. Are there any countries or parties or people who you think are, pushing things forward and, finding good ways to make politics work in this new era?
Well, I mean, I think I pointed to Estonia. It's probably an unfair thing to do to the poor Estonians because they're just a small country. But Estonia has digitized to a pretty astounding their politics and their their public life to a pretty astounding degree. For example, every Estonian citizen owns his own public information. Everything that is known, there's one set, part of what drives people crazy, that whatever institution you go to, they ask you the same questions over and over again. You give all this information, they keep their set, and the next institution will be different. So if it's state or if it's local or if it's government or is this side of the government or that side of the government, you have to be put through this who are you and why should I care process. In Estonia, you have one set of information. You can do any number of things, including voting online. It is a country of about 1 million people. So you could probably do that. I live in Fairfax County, Virginia, and that's got a population of about 1.2 million. So you could probably do that in Fairfax County, Virginia. Whether Virginia itself could do it is a question. The United States, I've sat in the bureaucracy of the United States government. It's just, you have no idea how the digital structure is alien to it. It just doesn't know what to do with it. It's simply, it looks at it and it wants to be. It's not even like it's repelled by it. We have to be just like the private sector. We have to be just like Google. And they just kind of smash into a wall trying to do it. They have no idea what they're doing. So start small. Start at the local level, maybe the state level for some of the smaller states. You can get closer to that social and commercial reality in your political reality. And I think Estonia has done that some degree.
So at 80,000 Hours and in effective altruism in general, we're very concerned about the long-term future of humanity, which means that we care about potential catastrophes like war between the US and China, or a nuclear war, whether accidental or deliberate. I guess also we're concerned about really bad political outcomes like some kind of ongoing dictatorship. How do you feel like the revolt of the public, like does it make those things more likely or less likely? It's a tough question, but...
Yeah, this is totally speculative, but okay, I'll tackle it because I think the book addresses it to some extent. In the old democracies, and then you can make a different case for newer democracies like Turkey and Venezuela and so forth. But in the old democracies, I would say The revolt of the public makes authoritarianism almost impossible. What you have is the opposite. You have state organizations, state institutions weakened to a great degree, disintegrating to a great degree, even literally so in some countries like Britain, where the Scotland wants to break off, and in Spain, the Catalans want to break off. But even within the mainstream country, there is a fragmentation of politics. You mentioned Spain. Spain used to be basically bipolar, like we are. Democrats, Republicans, they had socialists and conservatives. Now, after every election, there's a pause of months sometimes trying to figure out who the heck gets a government. Nobody knows. There's so many parties, right? So the idea of an authoritarian government is to me very unlikely. What I worry about is that nihilism. And if you want to see the most extreme version of nihilism and power, look at ISIS. I mean, people who basically were there because they were in revolt against the modern world as it appeared to them. But these were very modern people. These were not primitive people. These were a lot of young people who are very internet savvy, and many of them highly educated. But they hated history. There's a pervasive thread throughout the revolt of the public is a looking at history not as a store of lessons or a store of memories that the human race has accumulated, but as basically the origin of all bad things, the origins of repression, the origins of defeat, the origins of lack of authenticity. And if you're ISIS, you're out to basically eradicate history. And you do that by basically killing a lot of people. You have very little in the way of a positive program, very little in the way of an ideology, hardly any organization. They had a caliph, al-Baghdadi. His speeches are very enlightening because they're just rants about history. But they hardly had an organization. They were just there to bash at the world as it is today. And many, many hundreds of thousands of people have died in that circumstance. So you want to worry about something that the revolt of the public may trigger. It is that. And we get that in little. We get the person you have the internet ranter who does the death threat. And at a certain point, that person crosses over from the virtual to the real, picks up a gun, and for no particular reason, even though he may have some little ideological reason, but for no particular reason, starts shooting innocent people and killing them.
So the risk is more chaos than totalitarianism.
Yeah, that is my fear.
Yeah, do you have any particular view on like what this is going to do to international relations? Will it make it harder for countries to cooperate and avoid conflict?
Now, that's a good question. I'm not sure. Honestly, I think what it's got to do is create an inward, much more of an inward looking. I think international relations are going to become far less important than they have been since World War II, and certainly since the end of the Cold War. I think you can see it now. Countries are turning inward. There's this kind of people score points off of each other for inward politics. That's what you have now is everybody's internal politics and their foreign politics are part of the same. So Macron gets to give a speech about how nationalism is not patriotism in front of Trump, who had just said he was a nationalist. And then when the demonstrations hit the street in Paris, Trump is gloating about it on his Twitter stream. So each is trying to basically pose to his domestic audience by taking the stand in the foreign policy. I think we're going to probably be, this off the cuff, I haven't thought about it all that much, but I think it's probably going to be a much more inward, much less outward oriented world until we work out how to survive the new digital age in terms of our politics.
Yeah, so you're a busy guy. We've been talking for a while, so I've got to let you go in a minute. But perhaps just to wrap up, would you like to kind of paint a vision for like how the future could go well, and maybe give a bit of a call to arms for listeners to contribute to it?
I think, as I say, many of the individuals involved in a lot of these circumstances are not only good and dedicated and brave, but noble individuals. I think the change in a strange way is in a way seems to be very simple, and that's usually the hardest thing to do, which is in looking at the other side of this great divide of the public and the elites, and seeing humanity on the other side, and seeing validity on the other side. Because until that happens, it's going to be very hard to, number one, avoid these eruptions from below, and number two, avoid these populists who basically straddle the divide and appeal to one side or the other. So, yeah, I think that change can happen. Like I said, it's a generational change. I think if you can look, flatten the pyramid the way that Estonia has done, structurally flatten the pyramid, I think you could have a new generation of elites who are conscious of being citizens, conscious of being just ordinary people who happen to have achieved an extraordinary end, and who treat the rest of us in a way that we find, yeah, this guy could be my next door neighbor, only he's the president or he's my senator. I mean, our politicians used to be very good at this. I don't know what's happened. The politicians have run a circle around each other, and they seem to want to impress each other more than they want to appeal to the public. So this is not a hard thing to do. This generation of elites seem to have lost the knack. So it's going to be younger people. And so then at that point, you open up the possibility of having this digital expansion of government where you can flatten, for example, you can poll the public about their opinions about any number of policy issues before you pass a law. You can post laws online in different versions and have the public comment on them. If it doesn't end on death threats, and if it doesn't end on the kind of polarized, extreme, violent language that it does today, you have flattened the government to a place where it is far closer to the people. And there is no reason why that can't happen. That will be, alas, Rob, your generation's burden.
The book is The Revolt of the Public and the Crisis of Authority in the New Millennium. And my guest today has been Martin Gurri. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast, Martin.
It's been fun.
All right, so I've got Keiran and Michelle, my colleagues here, to share their reactions to the episode. Did you have any strong views about it?
Okay, so my first impression of this episode was that I thought, well, my main criticism was, which I've already said to Rob, but I thought that an alternative timeline Rob that had never heard of EA could have recorded this episode. He could have given most of the pushback. So when Rob's asking about different examples about Spain and Canada and China, I felt like it was never actually tied to our questions. And I'm biased about this because I wrote most of the EA related questions, but I felt like I always wanted it to be tied back into, well, how does this actually relate to us? What are the implications for us? We had a section going into this. What are the implications for do-gooders? And, if we accept Gurri's thesis about creating this new elite class, well, is that going to be us? And if it's us, what are we going to do about it? So should we be thinking in terms of positioning ourselves as becoming intellectual elites, or would that actually put people off to the point where we couldn't actually achieve any of our political goals?
Yeah, you're meant to be critiquing Martin Gurri here, Keiran, not critiquing my performance.
No, I mainly view this as a critique of you. I mean, this is
finally you get your chance to air your grievances.
Yeah, this is
on
really
the show. Yeah, I think it's a good point. I guess I was very interested in like digging down into whether this is a persuasive story, whether this is actually the right model for thinking about things. Because I read the book twice preparing for the interview, and it's influenced how I see all of these things. I'm now starting to apply this model whenever I notice people complaining about how the country is being governed and taken to the streets. And I worry that maybe it's too much, that I'm giving too much weight to this particular way of seeing things, because it's not. I'm worried that it's too easy to create a narrative like this, to create a story that explains things when you're able to to elaborate on it a lot. And unless you actually look for all of the cases where the model fits the data in a particular country, but you also look for all of the cases where the model doesn't fit the data that you're seeing, and try to see how strong is actually the fit, then you can just end up it's too easy to spin all of these stories any story, and it could be right or wrong, but it's going to sound kind of compelling. So yeah, that's I guess why I was pushing back on that.
So you mentioned that you found this quite persuasive in changing your views. What aspects of his argument did you find the most persuasive?
I guess the description of how these nihilistic or protest movements seem to be operating internally, what drives the people and how they're coordinating, it does seem to fit that data relatively well. And also kind of the mystery of why is it that we're seeing these particular protest movements that we didn't before at a time when things seem to be going fairly well. It provides an alternative explanation for why you see so much discontent that doesn't require you to say, well, conditions are objectively worse than they used to be, which they don't seem to be.
So how troubled are you by the fact that we don't see similar movements in, as you said in the podcast, in Canada and Australia?
Yeah, it's definitely not great for the theory. I suppose it would be more compelling if you were seeing this like in more places where things were going fine. I guess Martin's approach is to say, well, maybe they will in future. This like creates the possibility of these protest movements taking off, but it doesn't necessarily say that they will in every particular case. You need like a spark, and it's perhaps a somewhat chaotic, chancy event. Another synthesis that I thought of after the episode was that in most other ways, the world seems to be becoming more stable and more boring. As people get older, like, conditions become more pleasant, so people are less likely to revolt. And so you might think that all else equal, the world would have become more boring. There'll be fewer protest movements, like less instability in politics. And I guess Martin's model potentially explains like why it hasn't gone to zero, even in these like relatively wealthy countries. And it's explaining kind of what's left. Like, in as much as we do have protest movements, this is kind of the nature of them, that they're based on people feeling totally unimpressed with their leaders because they've got access to more information. So all things considered, if you looked at the entire model, you might not say it's going to cause an increase in the total number of protests everywhere in the world. But this will explain like the ones that are left.
I thought the timing question was something that you didn't touch on that seemed kind of interesting to me and might somewhat answer the question of why aren't we seeing these in Canada and Australia? Because it seemed like a lot of the changes he was talking about happened in the early 2000s, but then all the protest movements actually were in 2011. So it seemed like it took a while for this actually to happen. And I guess the thing I'd been assuming was going on there was something more like this created the conditions where this might happen. And he seemed really clear that he wanted to say this is just creating the conditions rather than actually being causal. In which case you might think that they kind of set each other off. You know, it seems pretty clear in the case of the Arab Spring that like one of them happened. That's what led to other ones. And so you might just think that, well, it took quite a few years from these changes in the early 2000s for this to actually happen, and these things are going to happen as well in other countries, and it's not something you should expect to happen, you know, at a really frequent pace. And maybe it superficially looks like you'd expect it to happen at a quick pace, but actually that's just because several of these set each other off, and then maybe we should expect another spate of them, but not for like 10 years or something.
Yeah, I guess that sounds right. I suppose on the question of timing, it's hard to know exactly what this model should predict in saying like when should we see this uptick in discontent, because it's kind of been a somewhat continuous exponential growth in the like number of different information sources that people have access to, such that there's not really like a sudden like 1 year where suddenly like the internet was switched on and everyone had access to everything, but before they didn't. It's like just more and more people getting online, and like cable news came before that, which was like fewer sources of information, but like still potentially a big increase on what people had access to before. So that makes it a bit harder to kind of get a great identification condition as a statistician might think, because it's just, well, one of these things is going up. The other one is like also potentially just changing continuously, but it could be like many things that are driving that, which isn't to say that the theory is wrong at all. It just means that it's like going to be harder to definitely attribute changes in one thing to changes in another.
So getting back to the implications for us, let's assuming that the thesis was correct. So I pulled out a key quote. Gurri said, "Assume that the public is as intelligent as you are. That is an assumption that is never made or rarely made." Gurri talks throughout the episode about this new class of elite, this legitimate class rising up, and we were trying to get into what that actually meant, which I think was a bit blurry. But if it did look something like us, if it was that we were taking positions of power or people like us, how do we actually deal with these questions that are posed? Like, would a public revolt against us in the same ways if we used tactics that we thought would work today? Or do we actually try and build a framework where we can be honest and we can say, yes, we actually do think we have better information. We think we do have an answer to this question.
So I suppose the Trump phenomenon makes me wonder whether people might enjoy it as like an interesting break from the way that politicians usually address people. It seems like you can get away with like a lot more like interesting and like insulting messages, and as long as you seem like an authentic person and you're owning the whole thing and not seeming like fake. Yeah, and it's I don't know whether we've seen many people try that approach. Yeah, do we really have any like authentic like technocrats or something who go out and like they're a technocrat of the people or something like that?
No, I mean, I suppose the closest might be Macron in getting elected.
Okay, yeah.
But still not quite. I mean, you don't get the impression that he's really being himself.
You don't get the impression that he like heads down to the pub either to like.
No, exactly. Yeah. But again, if he doesn't head down to the pub, then being authentic is to admit that, is to say, I don't head down to the pub, but that's actually okay. And maybe in a leader, you don't want that.
Yeah.
And maybe that kind of just being blatantly honest, embracing who you actually are, is that a positive, to be genuinely authentic, or is it always this game where you're trying to appear authentic?
Yeah, I think it would be worth more people trying the authentic route, if only because it seems like that's something that the public is hankering for, and there's enough randomness in this entire process that and it's also so much better as a politician, so much nicer when you get elected to actually be able to be yourself and to actually state your real opinions rather than constantly putting on a facade.
That's a really good point. Yeah,
it's in as much as it only lowers your chances of getting elected and more moderately, but then you can actually be more sincere, and you don't have to be acting and thinking double thinking about everything that you're saying all the time. Maybe it's just worth more people taking that shot.
I think that would also potentially create better long-term incentives for people to go into politics, because at the moment we have this issue where most people within politics are not who we would think of as our best and brightest. I mean, it's the most talented young people tend to go into other professions. If you had the opportunity to go into politics and really be yourself, and you didn't have this impression that you had to play a game, it was really just going in and representing people and doing the best for them within your own framework of what you think is actually best and being authentic, I think it might be quite appealing.
Maybe. I can imagine it being more pressure filled as well, because you might think that right now you aren't going to have to open up your full self to the whole world. Whereas I'd imagine you just feel hugely vulnerable if you were trying to actually show your entire self to everyone in the whole country.
Do you have views for how this thesis, again, if we accepted it, would impact our career advice for people who wanted to go into government?
I suppose there's an obvious sense in which it suggests that people shouldn't go into government as much, because in as much as listeners to the show are very unrepresentative of the general public and in their policy preferences or style, then they're contributing to this problem of the government not being seen as legitimate, not being seen as representative, or at least it suggests people should make more compromises between their ideal policies, which say might be focused on helping foreigners who are non-voters versus voters or constituents in a particular area.
Although that would go against his dream of having this new elite class rise up and be authentic.
Yeah, it just seems tricky. Let's say that your main policy priority was improving foreign aid. It just seems very hard to get elected on a platform that's mostly focused on helping people who can't vote. And so that's one reason that, because we're focused on helping groups that are so disadvantaged that they don't have any say in the political system, like farmed animals or foreigners or people who don't exist yet. That's one way where it's very hard to go out and build a popular movement around these causes. That's kind of an underlying challenge. I suppose we could compromise on that and say, well, no, we actually are going to focus on things that help voters and current day voters, because that will allow us to be more in touch and not contribute to this problem as severely. But it might just be outweighed by other factors.
I guess my feeling is that he indicates that now is a particularly non-tractable time to go into politics, because you have these kind of two groups of stakeholders where you have the existing elites for whom you have to talk in a particular way and play the certain game. And then also you have the public, which are likely to try and cut down these elites. And so you have to talk in a totally different way and about totally different issues in order to get them on board, and that it was much easier either in the past when you could just fit into the existing elite, or potentially in future when you actually do have this new understanding of what elite should look like or something. And so it indicates that we're at a time of history when you in particular should think that it's difficult to go into politics and you're going to be able to get less done than either in history or in the future. I don't know if I agree with him on that, but it seems to be a corollary of his argument.
Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, has been, I'm not sure whether you've been following this one, but yeah, it seems the last month or two, she does seem to have been kind of living out the approach that Martin seems enthusiastic about, where she just got elected, basically just promoting exactly her views, whether you think that they're good policy ideas or not. She's extremely direct and certainly not at the center of the political spectrum. And also just on a personal, she just seems to be an extremely authentic person all the time. She's Snapchatting her induction to the Congress. She's constantly just tweeting, making fun of the people who are criticizing her in the same way that probably I would. So it does seem like there is a potential approach to doing that. I guess she may have gotten lucky in the primary fight in that seat, where it seemed like the incumbent was particularly out of touch and particularly uninterested in appealing to voters there. But nonetheless, she's doing extremely well. Taking this approach.
I I feel like we're not quite pinning down what traits it is that we're talking about, because we're kind of talking about it as if being an authentic person means tweeting a whole bunch and using things like Snapchat, when presumably for a lot of existing elites, it's actually just pretty authentic for them to be relatively reserved and spend most of their time, maybe they don't really like tech, maybe they are more kind of slowly thoughtful or something rather than putting out a lot of content quickly. And so I'm not really sure if the thing we're talking about is authenticity so much as like radical openness or something. So what the public's looking for is not that they are genuine all the time, but that they're doing that they're acting in a way that means that the public has access to their thoughts all the time, something like that.
Yeah, so people made the joke that Hillary Clinton was being extremely authentic. She was an extremely authentic, awkward person who is not relatable. She's just being herself, and I guess people didn't like it. But yeah, I think maybe it is like relatability more than authenticity. I suppose if you're like being inauthentic, then that probably is going to be hard to relate to. But it is true that you can be authentic and still like not terribly likable or not terribly relatable to ordinary people if you just come from a completely different social group.
Which actually has real implications. So that's if it is relatability that we're really concerned about, it means that someone like a Rob 10 years from now going into politics would have to have a very different strategy than if it is about authenticity. He would have to be more inclined to make compromise, at least on honesty.
And I think it's something that we need to keep in mind, that that's the thing that we're really talking about, because I think it would be easy to think that what we're talking about is authenticity and then end up with people feeling that they have to massively fake authenticity or something.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been optimizing my like character and CV in order to get elected. It would probably like do very different stuff.
The fact that you haven't means that you have this opportunity to be authentic. So if you had been optimizing to get elected, that would be, I would say, almost by definition, inauthentic.
Yeah, it's interesting angle on it. What if you're thinking, well, with the current social group that I'm moving with, I'm going to like I'm just going to become a person who's very unrelatable to voters. So I have to like not hang out with my like other elite friends. I have to go and actually hang out with ordinary people and make sure that my life brings me into touch with the kind of people who I would be interested in having vote for me, so that I can relate to them and speak their language. In that case, maybe it's like inauthentic at the point that you make that decision at the age of 30. And then by the time you've like changed your character and you're like 40 or 50 and like are actually kind of more sort of the earth politician, it might seem authentic by that stage.
Yeah, I mean, so the question would be whether it would seem authentic or whether it would actually be authentic. If you did make a genuine change, I suppose if we were looking for real authenticity, you would then have to say, okay, so when I was 30, I made this decision to be actively inauthentic by moving to a completely different social group. I wanted to get elected. Now that I am elected, I can tell you all about it. And you would have to then reflect on it honestly.
Yeah, I mean, I think even authentic and likable and relatable people don't say absolutely everything that pops into their head.
No, and you're under no obligation to. But if you
that would be one way.
If you were presenting yourself as though you were you would always been salt of the earth. You would always grown up around these people. I think that would be a fairly key part of your history. So by omitting that, I would think that it's dishonest.
Okay, so Trump and like Sanders, they're not like super relatable, I guess, to most voters, right? Their lives have been like very unusual. They don't actually live like the kinds of lives that most people voting for them, presumably. I mean, they're a totally different age, a totally different generation than most of the voters who are voting for them to begin with. It does seem like perhaps one thing is just like not feeling like people are lying to you all the time is kind of key. It was like most politicians are so reserved that it just feels like they're being like, that their response to every question is basically to think like, what's like the least dishonest thing that I can say that will get me out of this situation.
Yeah.
Whereas like Trump and Sanders, you don't get that impression.
Well, yeah. I mean, Trump has kind of destroyed all of our ideas about that because he lies more frequently than anyone else. And yet he comes across as authentic to his base because they sort of have the feeling that, well, he's kind of winking to us. You know, he's lying constantly, but we know he's lying, and therefore that means that it's okay.
I think I really like this idea of authenticity as a thing that we're using to decide which politicians to vote for. It seems like what we really care about with politicians is, are they telling the truth? And then something like, are they speaking from dispositions that we can expect them to continue with in future? So it doesn't feel like there's really any problem with people deliberately setting up their life such that they would be a good politician, right? Because what we actually care about is, will they then act how I would want the politician to act? And I think that's actually what we are, or at least should be, getting at when we seek for our politicians to be truly authentic. Our worry is, well, this person's like pretending to be one of us, but then when he gets the chance to vote on will he raise taxes for my group, he will choose to raise taxes. And so in some ways it seems like we might be wanting to vote for people like Trump because we think they're authentic, in the sense of, I just expect him to have poor impulse control. And so I feel like the fact that he's continuously telling me like what he thinks or something, even if it, I can see through the lies, means that I can trust the way that he will vote. And that kind of thing makes me think that the hypothetical in which someone totally changes who they hang out with at age 30 and things is worrying only insofar as you think, well, maybe I'll then vote them in and then they'll go back to hanging out with the people that I think will give them poor ideas or something. As long as you can trust that they genuinely will keep that up, it seems not problematic at all. And then I think the question of whether it's truly authentic is just not the relevant question to ask.
So Martin talked about, in terms of reclaiming the trust of the public, the importance of people in positions of power being willing to say that they were wrong and they were uncertain about positions. And in the effective altruism community, we take moral uncertainty very seriously, but I wonder if perhaps we don't push that message aggressively enough. Do you guys have a sense in which that's true, or how we could change that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a meme that hasn't seemed to be super viral. So I think it would require a decent active effort to push it, or at least you'd have to find like new ways of framing it. Because I guess it's hard to just push the message of we don't know. That's like, that doesn't tend to inspire people to like take to the streets saying, I'm not sure.
We don't know,
We're not as sure as we think we are. I'm agnostic about this issue.
People with a big sign that just has a question mark.
Yeah. I suppose another thing is we're extremely unsure about what the exact implications are of moral uncertainty when you follow it through. So it's perhaps like a bit too early to be popularizing it. But I guess it is, I mean, moral uncertainty, empirical uncertainty, it's like always hard to keep in mind just how like naive or how ignorant we are about the entirety of all the things going on in the world. And the human mind is just really not designed to be very agnostic about all kinds of, to be as agnostic as it should about a very complex like system that's much more complex than the world we were dealing with when humans evolved. So it's probably hard to go overboard emphasizing that, at least among people who want to be like actually taking action or who have power to change the world.
Yeah, I guess it feels like also something that's pretty relative to context and so hard to get precisely right, because you both want to be being clear about the things that you do know that might be surprising, but then you also want to be really clear about where your uncertainty ends. And it's so difficult to know what the beliefs of the person you're engaging with are, and so then you don't want to be sounding more uncertain than you are, and you don't want to be sounding less uncertain than you are, and it makes it a very difficult thing to communicate cogently about.
Martin Gurri, so he constantly refers to the elites. Did you have a good sense of what that meant? A lot hinges on what we actually mean by this word, because initially I thought it was just political elites, then of course it becomes clear that he's actually talking about anyone in a position of power within previously dominant institutions. So if you're a news anchor, that you're an elite.
I mean, that doesn't give any specificity to thinking that these people are different in any way other than their role, right? So I was thinking that these, I'm angry at this person simply because they're a news anchor, not because there are any properties about this news anchor that makes them feel not like me, except that they're the one on the news. If people were to get angry with someone, it's purely because of their role and not because of some class of properties.
I mean, if that's true, it means that we would have to be quite pessimistic on this idea of replacing this elite class. If it was just people within roles, then whoever we replace them with is going to have the same kind of pushback, even if they are very genuine, even if they are very honest.
I don't think we necessarily have to be pessimistic about it, because I think it would just imply having to change dynamics and maybe how democracy worked, maybe bringing in more direct democracy, maybe changing ways in which people engaged. And in a way, it's a more optimistic picture where you're not saying you have to change any of the actual individuals, that any of the people in these roles are bad, simply that you need to get these two groups getting on better, either by changing the ways in which they interact, or simply by them getting used to a new dynamic. And then on this, a thing I was thinking was kind of interesting was it seems a bit surprising that he seemed to be saying that the real problem between elites and the public was that each was insufficiently charitable towards the other, and so each is thinking that each is like malevolent in some way or something, when actually neither of them are. And you would expect, given that this whole that he thinks that the whole revolt of the public is caused by increasing information, you'd expect that this is a problem that would have gotten better rather than worse over time, because if both groups are actually good, the more information you get about each group, the better it is. And I was wondering whether what was really going on here was that it used to be that elites and the public thought of each other as being just totally different types of things and incomparable or something. And so there was no point getting angry with them. Just like if an outgroup is sufficiently different from you, you don't bother thinking about whether you disagree with them. And if that's the case, it could be that we're just looking for a new equilibrium where people have started to learn that actually they're the same types of people. And that's led to them noticing things that they're annoyed about, of like, oh, we're the same types of people, but you're like treating us like we're not, or something like that, or maybe you're doing these malevolent things. But then we actually just need to go continue in the same direction of like learning more about each other and things, and then we'll learn like, okay, we're the same types of people, and also that means that we both can get on, and that everyone can be charitable towards each other. How does that strike you guys?
That seems right to me. Yeah, I think that seems like a reasonable counterpoint to the thesis. This increase in information not leading to an increase in charitability.
Yeah, I thought that point really stuck with me. That it was like people in power like tend to look down with contempt at the public who they view as culturally very different from them, and like vice versa for different reasons. I guess the people in power like think that the general public are really prejudiced and quite stupid, whereas the general public is inclined to view anyone who has power as corrupt and self-serving. It does seem like there's obviously some truth potentially to both of those views, but it's like probably like the inclination on both parts, I think, is to massively overstate it. How much is down to like bad intentions versus how much is down to just like sincere error, given like the challenges of the world, and also to like overstate how useful it is to have that kind of contemptuous attitude. That like even if like in a sense someone like deserves contempt because they have like weaknesses as we all do, it's maybe just best to ignore that and try to like love them nonetheless, or at least like not to hate them. That would be like a big step forward in like making politics and society work better.
You recently wrote an article that gave tips along these lines, in saying that you ought to ascribe good motives to someone where possible. Do you think that it's plausible that these kind of norms could spread throughout, let's say, the United States?
Well, I feel just like the current information environment just really isn't pushing in that direction. Actually, I suppose maybe I'll take that. Maybe I'll walk that back. I mean, so it does seem like social media has made things probably worse in this, and that where you spend more time interacting through a medium in which you don't get the normal cues that like arouse like human sympathy that you normally do when you're talking to someone face to face. Like, even if someone is acting quite badly face to face, I think it's much harder to get angry with them than the equivalent person on the internet. But it does seem like there's so many people have noticed this and like gotten dissatisfied with it that I do wonder whether there'll be like a cultural counter reaction to it that can at least maybe temper this damage.
Yeah, I think, as always, I'm more optimistic than you, Rob, and think that we're actually doing fairly well at learning more about how humans work and how to improve techniques like cognitive behavioral therapy, and that in general the world has been on an upward trajectory, and we're going to get better at teaching our kids how to be more charitable and building tools such that they are more conducive to positive human interactions rather than negative ones. And it's pretty explicable that when we first developed things like these social media tools, we wouldn't really know how to deal with them well, and we would use them badly, but that we'll get much better at that, both in terms of building tools that are good and in terms of learning how to use them in ways that lead to better human interactions.
Yeah, I mean, the world's getting better in most ways, but I guess I feel like the media has mostly gotten worse. Like the sharper competition between outlets has led to like a degradation in quality. And the transfer of like discussions to the internet seems to have mostly made things worse. And I'm not sure like what's the strong enough force to reverse that trend. I suppose you could hope you get kind of cultural antibodies to these negative or like people or like learning effects. But I do just wonder whether that is going to be strong enough to like turn back the tide in the other direction.
Do we have worse media outlets now? I mean, certainly some seem to have gotten worse and to have gotten more partisan, but you also have different types of media outlets springing up. Vox's style of explaining a whole issue seems markedly better to me than the more traditional newspaper where you're just getting bite-sized chunks every day.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of this plays into perceptions versus actual reality of the reporting too. So, as you say, Vox can have some excellent articles, but from people who don't already consider themselves Vox subscribers, if they already look at them as the other, as the enemy immediately, we're now in a situation where, unlike, let's say, I mean, it was maybe a high watermark for American journalism post-Watergate, but people didn't used to look at NBC and say like, oh, that's the other team. It was just basically we had this shared news. Whereas even if Fox is doing a really good job on any particular article, if somebody comes to that with the view that they're not on my team, therefore it doesn't matter, they're probably wrong, that seems like a problem that is going to be very difficult to fix. So even if the institutions were doing really good work, and obviously there's incredible investigative journalism going on, they need to have that coupled with this respectability. Yeah, I mean, I guess things seem pretty bad now. Maybe I haven't lived long enough to have known on a day-to-day basis how bad things were before. From memory, the number of journalists in the US has halved, I think, over the last 10 or 20 years, just because the whole business model has been broken by the internet. And it, no doubt there are some really outstanding outlets producing good journalism as it kind of always has been, but it seems to me the stories that get the most attention these days are probably worse. There just seems to be more bullshit stories than kind of ever before. Certainly television news used to be a loss leader for the companies. It used to be, okay, we know we're going to lose money in this, but we're doing a public service here. Whereas now most media institutions, they need to generate revenue. So that is done around clicks. And unfortunately, the stories that get the most clicks are not necessarily the best reported ones. I mean, New York Times had, this incredibly in-depth investigation about Trump's taxes a few months ago. It seemed basically got no traction. The public just didn't care. You have these really incredible reporting and these stories, and they just get less of a reaction than something that's maybe just 500 words but plays into what you already think about the other side.
How much do you think this varies between countries? Because you might expect that in Britain, with the BBC getting the TV license subscription fee, they just are going to be able to afford to continue doing excellent journalism in a way that no network in the US will be able to.
Yeah, I mean, public broadcasters can be shielded from this and potentially provide this public service, or that there's a subsidy for investigative journalism or writing stories that people might not be interested in reading, but it's important that they exist. Whereas it's harder in a purely market environment to support that. And state media is a bit of a wild card to throw in there, because it can be very good in this way if you set it up correctly, that they provide a more sober analysis, and they don't really care whether they have a large viewership or not. They're just going to try to do a good job. It can also obviously just become an arm of the government to promote their views and not be any high quality than anything else. And I think that's the case in the majority of countries. The BBC seems to be doing substantially better than that, and so does the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. They've managed to set it up such that the government doesn't have too much direct control, and it kind of does provide a public service. But I mean, it's a very difficult problem to solve. So you got this, seems market media. The quality is getting worse because the business model that supported it has weakened. You could try doing it through non-profits, but there's probably just not enough people willing to donate to support very much of that. There's some of it ProPublica, and I guess people donate to The Guardian and things like that. which like might change their incentives a bit. And then you've got government. I mean, would you really want like Trump starting up like a broadcasting corporation in the hope of like providing the public service of informing us all? I mean, maybe not. So I'm actually just not really sure what is the solution to this. I suppose you could try to get like a lot more people enthusiastic about donating to like really high quality journalism, and maybe that's the best we can do. But I don't imagine that's going to bring in billions and billions of dollars of revenue.
I was going to ask, do you think that it's plausibly important enough that those of us in the effective altruism community should be thinking about this as a potential cause area to actually be generating more donations towards independent media outlets? Or do you think that this is something that is either not going to generate enough interest or just wouldn't be able to track well enough against our other primary causes?
Yeah, I think someone who's in a good position to take this on, it's like is a really important problem in society and like reasonably neglected. There's not that many people trying to come up with new models for funding high quality information like discovery and provision. I suppose I just haven't been able to think of like a good solution here, so I've been a bit pessimistic about the tractability of it. It seems like the trends are negative. There's like lots of ways that things are getting worse, and I'm just not sure like what approach I would take if I was like gonna try to fix it. But it seems like the problem has like become more severe, and so I hope that we'll be able to do more interviews about this in future, like trying to like see whether anyone actually has any good ideas for like how you can change this on any significant scale.
I think I have a good sense of how many journalists and how much media I think would be the best. Because on the one hand, I mean, halving the number of journalists sounds kind of bad, but I have the general sense that most media is just not very high quality and not that good. And so actually you would be fine with substantially less as long as it was good. But then I don't know how much you actually need really good competition in order to get good journalism, and the extent to which you have to have more jobs in order that you attract some of the best people and things. My general feeling is that journalism is very competitive, and so you are attracting really good people, and that it would just be fine to have a bit less as long as it was high quality.
Yeah, I think we need less competition. It's like the competition that's like making things worse, because it just turns like, in the past, there was so much slack in the system. There was not that many channels, not that many newspapers that people had like could plausibly subscribe to in any given city, such that it was viable for them to have a lot of that they could take some of the extra profits that they were earning essentially from this oligopoly and like spend some of it on investigative journalism or doing what they thought was the right thing. Now that the margins are so fine, they don't have any discretion to do what they think is right potentially, because if they do that, they just get cut out of the conversation and go bankrupt, which is. It's an unusual business where you say, well, in fact, like less competition might make things better. I mean, part of the issue is that the media, I think, now is providing what we want, but it turns out that what we want is like entertainment and like hating on our enemies more than like reading some like really in-depth story about like Trump's taxes. That's just a lot of work and not very rewarding, I think, to most readers, even though they would like for that story to like exist. They'd be willing to pay if their contribution like made the difference between that story existing and not. Then they might be willing to pay for that someone to go and do that work in order to make the country better. But there's this like really strong temptation to freeload on and to not contribute to paying for the kind of people who would work and do that difficult research.
How much of this do you think can be replaced by books? Because you might think that it's now easier than ever before to write and publish a book. And you might think that most of the things that you really want investigative journalism done on actually you'd like done in a lot of depth. And so that might be able to improve this problem a bit.
Yeah, that seems like a good point. I suppose if you consider like all different information that people have access to, I guess it's not clear that the environment as a whole has gotten worse, because people have access to like academic journals more easily than they used to. Like, yeah, there's like more books being published. I guess I'm not sure what the typical quality is. We have access to Wikipedia, for example. It just seems like the things that kind of day-to-day journalism focuses on seem to be the things that have gotten worse. So I guess I'm not sure whether the public as a whole is like more misinformed, like all things considered across all issues. But when it comes to like politics and the kind of like day-to-day fights that you read about in Vox or Fox News, that seems to be degrading worse.
I mean, if we don't think that the public is less well informed than it previously was, then it seems a bit surprising to think that it's an important cause for effective altruists to work on to increase the extent to which the public's informed, even if they're now getting most of their information from different sources like Wikipedia and books, unless you think that the fact that specifically mass media is degrading means that we have this huge opportunity to make the public way better informed than it used to be, and we need to be taking that.
Yeah, so I guess I just think of them as different problems. Like, so people who are interested in reading books and like reading encyclopedias and learning about history or learning about chemistry or something, in a sense, we've never had it better. But I think there's like a subset of kind of the information environment, which is like political fights, where the typical quality of things that people are reading on that issue is worse.
I'm not sure I agree that these things are really in different categories, because when I want to learn about some particular political fight, I will very often go to Wikipedia, because what I actually want is a summary of what's been happening over the last month and a half or something.
Yeah, so do I, but I think that's very unusual. Like Wikipedia doesn't push its articles in the same way into like come up with snappy titles and snappy like hooks to try to get people to read it and then like, click through from their newsfeed. That's like something that you would do if you're like really interested in the topic on like on some policy level. But I think that's like a vanishingly small fraction of like total readership.
I think I feel a bit uncomfortable about the framing that we're using to learn how we might want to apply this for improving the world, where it feels a bit like we're using this to think through, okay, how does this mean we should be trying to change other people's actions or something? Whereas I think it could be that actually the thing that we should be most using this in is thinking about how this might bias our own actions. So one thing that stood out to me was that the public protest movements that he was talking about often were basically just negation. They often weren't aiming at anything in particular. And that felt like it was getting at some kind of general psychological trend in humans where we tend to feel, well, this is wrong and I should do something about that. And then it's actually much harder to take this final step of being constructive and working out what thing to do about it. And often by that point, you feel like you've put in a ton of effort. You went to the protest and you did your part. And you can see that in things like the protest after the Brexit vote or something, where people who maybe didn't actually go out knocking on doors, getting people to vote Remain, then all went to London to protest about. And I think one thing that we should really be learning as effective altruists from this like synthesis of here are all of these movements is that it's going to be super easy for us to generally criticize things and to point out all of the ways in which things are failing and point out these charities are being less effective than they could be, and people should be thinking differently, and people should be, instead of being super constructive and thinking about, okay, but how do we create the institutions that will be positive in future?
That seems right to me, yeah. I'm not sure if we got into it as much as we wanted to, but yeah, the idea that we could as a community be susceptible to this idea of negation seemed to be really important. That it's a very young movement, but it seems plausible that if we existed in 30 years, you could get more and more towards this idea of trying to be, as you say, overly critical, as opposed to creating these, worthwhile policy alternatives, which I think we do at the moment, which Rob pointed out in the interview. But yeah, I wanted to know what Martin thought about how we protect against that impulse, if it is a universal human impulse.
Yeah, I think it feels to me like that did ring true as a human impulse, partly because there's the obvious saliency of, well, if someone brings a thing to me, then I can think of what might be wrong with it. But then it's a whole extra step to work out what I should do next. And I don't know how self-congratulatory we should be about this, in thinking that effective altruists are good at avoiding this negation problem. Sure, it seems like we try harder at it maybe than some other groups, but actually it does feel like the emphasis on effectiveness can easily blur into an excessive emphasis on the negative and on what other people are doing wrong, rather than on what things we can notice are going well in the world and what we should increase in the world, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I guess we've tried from like back in 2011, 2012 to like discourage people from just shitting on the efforts of others. which obviously is like a pretty strong temptation at times. It can be fun.
Some more than others.
No doubt. I guess, yeah, maybe at 80,000 hours, because we rarely put up discussions of problems when we have like no sense of the tractability or no sense of what can be done. There is this push to be at least somewhat constructive, even if I guess a lot of the time we are just criticizing things that don't work or talking about problems that we think are overemphasized. But hopefully we can keep that in and expand that even more. So we don't just fall into this trap of criticizing things that don't work without like actually having a better alternative. So I guess people might look at the current like peculiar nature of politics in the US and to a lesser extent the UK and hope that things are going to go back to normal in the next election. I kind of still hope that might be the case, that this would just have been an unusual 4 to 6 years, and then maybe we'll just like elect someone boring next, and policy discussions will return to how they used to be. But I suppose if Gurri's thesis is correct, then that's probably not going to happen. We'll probably think things will like remain peculiar for some time. Although I guess people's like behavior and reactions to this new circumstance might change. So it's like doesn't necessarily have to be the same kind of weirdness that we have now. So what do you think? Should we be like optimistic or pessimistic about where this is going to go in the next 10 or 20 years?
I'm genuinely uncertain. I just think that I don't think the Gurri has persuaded me enough to the point where I'm now going to say like, oh, okay, well, I'm willing to make a strong prediction one way or another.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm even totally persuaded that politics is wackier now than it has been if you look over the, a broader time horizon than just like 8 years ago or something. Do you feel that you are pretty sure of that?
It does feel like it's a bit worse than average, but I suppose it's not clear whether it's worse than like Nixon or I'm trying to think. It's like there was a lot of like racism like throughout U.S. history. If you like look at what the kind of policies that were getting proposed in the 90s by very mainstream politicians, they're like perhaps not as like different than what we see today from people who we consider quite radical. So it could be that it's like this is just made more visible, something that like has always been the case, and in fact we're like overestimating how much things have actually changed. And I suppose just it could be that just the very crowded like Republican primary is like an unusual like voting system that allowed like a set of views that were always like common but nonetheless a minority to achieve like a much higher level of prominence.
Do you have a sense of whether if a candidate has a particularly strong policy, for example, trying to implement massive tax cuts, whether that's likely to make the tax cuts that are implemented, in fact, greater or lesser? Because I can both imagine that if they ask for something very unreasonable, then they end up getting totally blocked and no tax cuts go through. Or I can imagine it going the way where people were thinking that they'd, accept some smallish tax cut, and then the person's just giving such a huge initial bid that they end up being willing to accept much more than they would have otherwise.
It would be kind of surprising, I guess, if like electing someone who had a very strong view in one direction, like set it backwards, all things considered, or like in expectation. I suppose if they're like extremely unstrategic politically, then I guess it could end up like producing a kind of reverse effect. I mean, you do see that with like a lot of the things that there's a lot of things that Trump supports, like the wall and like reducing immigration and reducing trade, that have actually become less popular while he's been president because he's radicalized Democrats to like oppose this. So like reducing trade has become more popular among Republicans, but Democrats have even to a greater degree like consolidated in favor of trade, and because they dislike Trump so much. So there are like a whole lot of forces that like push against someone having control. I guess also incumbents often become less popular because once they actually have to put forward like policies, people become dissatisfied. So and this is like very fitting with Martin's theory that it's like potentially easy to gain power by like complaining about the system, but then hard to hold on to it because like then people hate you because you're the status quo. That's like potentially like somewhat good, I suppose, because it means it's harder for like politics to go off in like one extreme direction and to kind of get snowball effects where like you gain power and then you gain even more power and so on. It seems to be that it's hard for anyone to pursue an agenda for any significant period of time. Often like any particularly large direction. Although I suppose if you think the status quo is very bad, that also isn't too appealing because it means that we're kind of stuck here with like only small modifications. And we're going to like swing back and forth and never really have like a concerted effort to shift things away from where we are.
Yeah, it also creates limitations on us being able to put forward policies that have the even medium long-term future in mind. So if a candidate comes forward talking about even the next 50 years, they're not getting any traction, then they'll just naturally just keep dropping down and down until it's just the next 4 years, maybe the next 8 years. And yeah, I'm not sure if I know a way out of that, but that seems pretty important for us to try and get a change there.
Yeah, it does. I guess you might think that we should, in fact, be really happy about this dynamic from the kinds of reasons that Martin said near the end of the podcast about authoritarianism now seeming entirely unviable, because it does seem like this dynamic of swinging back and forth is happening more and should mean that totalitarianism is just much less likely compared to looking at the number of times that FDR, say, had. And that could be a massive relief, because it does seem like one of the few things that could really destroy the value of the full far future is some totalitarian government that gets properly locked in. And if we can't even get near that because of these new dynamics, that could be something that makes the world much better.
Yeah, I wasn't entirely convinced by his answer there. I suppose probably it is true that if, in as much as the general public has access to lots of information and can oppose authority and challenge it, maybe it is harder to create a stable dictatorship. On the other hand, in as much as people are just like completely dissatisfied with how things are running and like have no trust in institutions, then I think it makes them more open to like radical shifts, like having a military coup. And so the military like runs a coup, and then people like kind of shrug their shoulders and like, well, everything was terrible anyway. And I think you see this in like in many countries, like perhaps in South America and in some European countries in the past, that in as much as people just kind of despair of like democratic politics functioning at all, then they're more open to like alternative arrangements because they just don't actually see it as being like materially worse.
I think you're right. Yeah, I think it potentially makes people more likely to allow for a military coup, and then we have to hope that the access to extra information makes it more likely they'll be able to get rid of them. But that may not be the case if someone's actually running things correctly. If you have a North Korea who is actually, giving you a blueprint for what you could do if you have total control, well, it's possible that a military could get themselves into that situation in any particular country. Particularly if the public are just, at least in the first stages, in the first couple of years of a government, just less interested. If this sort of leads to kind of burnout, if everything is just like, well, this is just, we're constantly dissatisfied, rather than having a change between we really liked this person, we didn't like this person. If they're always being against, they always have this spirit of negation, maybe that could make things more troubling.
I mean, the spirit of negation doesn't say anything about whether you couldn't have degrees of how much against things you are. And it seems that the kinds of things he's talking about are increased engagement rather than disengagement, which to me would make it less likely that you could have a military coup, because it's just more clear that you have a lot of people willing to engage and willing to engage in a vocal way that maybe you didn't at all in the past.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of barriers to like a military coup in the US today. I suppose, what if you did just have the kinds of people who are taking to the streets and complaining about the system as it is today did just like eventually despair of democratic politics ever like bringing about the changes that they wanted, because they've seen things go back and forth so many times, and like in their view nothing has gotten better. Would they then be like, well, we're not going to take to the streets when the military takes over because who cares? Like, well, we voted for Trump to like try to smash the system and make it different and get rid of these these people we don't like and who look down on us. And then, wow, this is just another shot at doing that. Sure, a very risky one, but like we were willing to take risks anyway because we were so dissatisfied with the status quo. I mean, I think the reason it won't happen, there's a lot of reasons that I think that's unlikely to happen anytime soon. In particular, I don't think the military would go along with it. I think they have too much of an ethos that's like in favor of following the Constitution. But you could see that being worn away over decades.
Yeah, my feeling is that you guys' point is that the strong engagement that we're seeing now, where people are willing to protest, is going to lead to burnout. I don't actually see any evidence that it's going to lead to burnout. The only evidence we have right now is increased engagement. And if we can see increased engagement now, then there's no reason to think that will lead to future disengagement, which could lead to military coup or something.
Yeah, I suppose it was just that an increased engagement might lead to a military coup just by virtue of not seeing them as being, too different from another political option. So they might actually go along supporting a military coup in a way of engagement, and then might realize a few months in, whoops.
Yeah, I guess Martin's point might be that you get the military takeover and people are like, oh, well, this is interesting. But then a month later, they hate it. And then they're all taken to the streets again. And it's so easy to coordinate against it that it wouldn't last very long. Just seems like there might be a lot of truth to that, especially because it's like the thing that ultimately sustains a military dictatorship is that the soldiers are willing to shoot on the public in order to like protect it, in as much as the public protests and tries to overthrow them. And it does just seem unlikely to me that would have a military coup here anytime soon. And then like when people take to the streets, the like typical members of the military are just going to start shooting on the American public. Maybe I'm naive, but that does seem like a bit of a stretch, like within the next 10 or 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, it actually speaks to realizing that we're actually not, in America at least, not in the worst phase of even recent history. If you look back at the early 70s and you had situations where you actually did have police firing on students and some really severe riots and actually people fighting in the streets, things that people are concerned about today but tend to not happen. You have groups that confront each other and there's a little bit of violence, but you really had that a few decades ago. And I think it's interesting to consider how much of our disagreements and animosity is just happening online, and whether it would extend to this, apocalyptic civil war that people sometimes talk about.
Yeah, I'm pretty interested in this question of whether there actually is more protesting now, because as you say, you had in the 60s and 70s in the US women's movement and youth movement, and it might be partly that it feels that we feel it more probably because you can see it much more because we have so much more media now, but it might also feel more salient because it's less clear what their demands are, and so it feels a lot less like, oh, well, those are the people that are protesting against the Vietnam War, so like we don't have to think about that except insofar as we're thinking about the Vietnam War, whereas things like Occupy Wall Street, it's a lot less clear and it's a lot more protesting against everything. And I think it'd be pretty interesting to know to what extent we should just expect people in general to always have some underlying feeling of the world should be better and always to want to protest something, even if they're not clear what they're protesting.
Martin made this point about he was part of the Vietnam War protests and he was there and he was with, his then girlfriend, now wife, pointed out that there was 1 million nonconformists who were all wearing blue jeans and that's what defined their generation for them. It was the protesters. It wasn't the people who stayed at home and just silently supported the war, even though most young people seem to. Do we have a sense of who's going to be viewed as sort of the key cultural figures of this era? I mean, do we think that in 30 years people will look back and say that there are these people who defined our generation, or are there so many different movements that it just isn't possible today?
Well, I think it's the 80,000 Hours podcast that's going to be at the vanguard of everything, Keiran. Yeah, I got no idea. I wouldn't want to be making predictions about that. Things seem pretty chaotic culturally in this, and politically. It's hard to tell who's going to be popular 2 years from now, let alone in decades from now.
Final thoughts. Did you enjoy the podcast, Michelle?
I very much enjoyed the podcast. Yeah, I thought that it was a really good discussion of the topic.
Excellent answer, just as we rehearsed, Michelle. All right, let's leave that there. Thanks for joining this impromptu discussion, Keiran and Michelle.
Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Rob.
I hope you enjoyed the 2 conversations above. If you did, you should definitely subscribe so you'll get reminded about Glenn Wile's episode, which should go out in the next couple of weeks. The 80,000 Hours podcast is produced by Keiran Harris. Thanks for joining. Talk to you in a week or 2.